Hello, my dear friends. Under the gold of the pyramids and thrones are secrets that history books don't talk about. Pharaohs were not only kings, but also took part in strange sexual rituals that even the gods had to look away from. They had sex with goddesses, masturbated in public, had sex with corpses, and turned virgins into offerings. Each act was wrapped in a special shell. But the truth was so obvious that it was shocking. Tonight, we will enter the world of sacred lust that the pharaohs had hidden for thousands of years. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Please tell me in the comments where you are and what time it is where you are. It's always interesting to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, to make the room darker, you could turn on a fan for that relaxing background noise, and let's start this journey together tonight. If you ever believed that ancient Egyptian pharaohs ruled with sacred discipline and divine clarity, you may want to think again about what happened behind the closed doors of their marble chambers. Under the golden light of the Nile, and in front of the huge sandstone temples, the royal family was seen as so holy that even love and desire had to follow its rules. But these rules were not the same as the ones most societies have today. In ancient Egypt, royal purity was very important. This meant that the lines between family and lover were not just crossed, they were expected to be erased. The pharaoh did not simply rule because of what the gods wanted. People thought he was a god. In Egyptian mythology, gods married their sisters and brothers. Pharaohs did the same. In the royal family, it was common for brothers and sisters to get married. These marriages were formal, and the royal family would celebrate them. A sister queen was not thought of as a moral problem. She was seen as the best choice for a king who needed to keep the royal family alive. If a man married a woman who was not a member of his family, it was thought that this would cause his family line to become impure. The crown often stayed with the same group of royal sons and daughters, one generation after the next. The daughter of a king could marry her father or brother. The cycle repeated itself, and it was easy to get through. The people accepted it. The priests approved it. The monuments recorded it. Many people today think that these unions were rare or just symbolic. But the records of archaeology suggest they were quite real. Hieroglyphic inscriptions carved into stone walls also show these relationships, but they are proud to say them. Pharaohs introduced their sister wives with full titles. Children born of these marriages were honored, not hidden. There was no shame because shame did not exist in a system that redefined morality according to a divine hierarchy. What might worry us now was once seen as the basis of order. It was not just marriages that made it unclear who was who. Physical intimacy between close relatives was part of a way of thinking that combined religion and biology. If Isis could marry Osiris, then a pharaoh marrying his sister was simply copying a divine example. It was an act of devotion, not deviation. In the modern world, royal families marry for political reasons or because they are in love. However, the Egyptians built their system around sacred repetition. They did not want to form any alliances. They wanted to be in control. They thought that the control started in the bedroom inside the palace. Some of the buildings were used only by royal women. Sisters, half-sisters, daughters, and nieces lived together in what was called the harem. This word has meanings in other cultures that don't apply here. In ancient Egypt, royal women were not kept secluded to protect them. They were held close for a reason. They knew that the next queen would be chosen from among them. Princesses were raised to expect that one day they might be chosen to be the pharaoh's wife. There was no need to keep it secret. Servants prepared their chambers in the same way they would for a political marriage. The ceremonies were formal, and the bedding rituals were written by priests. The birth of any child was recorded in detail. What I find so interesting is that these young women were seen as royalty and also as important for having children within their family. They were related to the king by blood and were expected to combine their blood with his again. But this closeness had consequences for generations to come. This strategy of inbreeding led to health problems that could be seen in the stone-carved statues and tombs. Some pharaohs had physical problems. Others died young. The well-known Tutankhamun is often said to be a victim of this system. His parents were probably brother and sister. He was very weak and his bones were fragile. His body was deformed. But none of these risks were seen as reasons to stop the tradition. The blood was pure, and that was more important than being strong. The practice carried on, not because it made sense biologically, but because it made sense in terms of what people believed. A pharaoh was not just a man. He was like a god on earth. He wanted to marry someone who was better than him. But if he thought all the other girls in the world were not good enough, how could he marry her? Only someone with the same status can do this. And that meant someone who was the same age, had the same parents, and the same name. Sometimes the pharaoh would take more than one wife. The queen consort was usually a sister. Other women might come from noble families, foreign lands, or even servant classes, but their children rarely had the same status. The children of the sister wife were the most legitimate heirs. Even if they were physically weaker or mentally unwell, they were still more spiritually powerful. In some cases, the close relationship can extend beyond the first generation. The daughters of these marriages were sometimes married to the next pharaoh, which made this cycle continue. One really scary thing that happened was that a man married both his sister and later his daughter. These patterns were not always written down, but the fact that the names and timelines are the same makes it pretty clear. It's hard to tell where loyalty ends and obligation begins. From the outside, the palaces looked neat and well kept. But behind the frescoes and flowered courtyards, the emotional lives of these royals must have been complex. Daughters learn to love their fathers, while sisters become brides. Brothers grow up with their future wives. In a world where everyone wore gold and linen and everyone prayed to the same gods, what did intimacy mean? What did love mean? The answer might be that those words weren't the most important ones. The real goal was not emotional fulfillment. It was a balance that had to be just right. In ancient Egypt, family lines were seen as rivers. They believed that these rivers should not mix with other rivers. Every time two siblings got together, it was like building a dam to hold back the flood of the unknown. They were afraid of disorder, and to them, nothing was more disorderly than mixing divine blood with the mortal world. The temples made these beliefs stronger. Stories about the gods carved into stone spoke of marriages that went against what was considered normal, but which showed that there was a special connection between people. Children in the royal family were raised on these myths. They didn't question them. Why would they do that? The gods did it. The priest approved it. The people cheered it, and the walls remembered it. As night fell on the palace and the corridors cooled, another royal woman might be taken down a hallway lit by flickering oil lamps. When she enters a room, it might already be prepared for her. It might not be romantic, but it will be practical. She will find linen beds, scented oils, and a quiet silence. She was more than just a sister. She was a symbol of continuity. Next, we will explore the royal chambers where the queen was not always the center of attention and where true intimacy often happened outside the royal family. Even in royal families, where bloodlines are carefully maintained, intimacy worked differently. The queen might have the highest title, but that didn't always mean the king was paying her any attention. The sister wife, who was like a queen, was there to represent something more than just love. She was there with the pharaoh at important events, which made it seem like they were a team, but this didn't mean they were close. Being queen was not as wonderful as most people thought it would be. She was often absent from the king's private chambers, but she was present in portraits and inscriptions. The truth was that many pharaohs found companionship, pleasure, and escape in other places. The palace was filled with women of different backgrounds and ranks, each chosen for different reasons. The queen was chosen as part of a royal strategy, but the concubines and handmaiden were chosen more for their personal qualities. Some were chosen because they were beautiful, others because they were good at dancing, singing, or talking. Many of these items came from other countries. They were either sent as gifts or taken by force. These women, though less important, often had more access to the pharaoh's private world than his official wife did. There were no strict rules about how many women a pharaoh could keep. The number of people involved changed depending on the ruler, but sometimes it was hundreds. These women lived within the harem, a complex network of courtyards, rooms, and gardens that existed within the larger palace compound. The harem was not a prison. It was a world of its own, with its own timetable, teachers, and servants. Women in the group were always being judged. We watched them. Their actions were based on what the ruler liked. It was not a place where you could relax. It was more like a silent competition to get noticed that would never end. The queen had to follow the rules, but the concubines could offer something else. They were expected to entertain, to comfort, and above all to submit. This attack was not necessarily violent, but it was planned and practiced. Their job was to make sure the king didn't feel overworked. As soon as he walked into the inner quarters, the language of politics was replaced by something more personal. The women were taught to know when to speak, when to stay quiet, and how to react to each change in his mood. This quiet choreography became part of daily life. Today, we think of romantic relationships as partnerships, but in the past, they were more like performances. The pharaoh didn't need to seduce or persuade anyone. He chose, and no one ever questioned that choice. A woman might be called to a room and then sent back to the main part of the building without anyone saying why. There was no expectation of consistency. One night could be nothing or everything. Some of the most popular mistresses gained influence that extended far beyond the bedroom. They were given jewelry, estates, and sometimes their sons were made potential heirs. In a system where political power was based on birth and popularity, the mother of a popular child could rise quickly. Even if she had started her life in the palace as a servant or a gift from a foreign land, her fate could change if the pharaoh was pleased with her. And this favor was never guaranteed. A woman might become successful very quickly, but this could also mean that she will quickly become unsuccessful again. Another might wait for years without being noticed before suddenly being called. The king's unpredictable behavior meant that the harem had to be ready at all times. Oils were prepared, clothing was kept fresh, and bodies were bathed every day. No one knew when it would be her turn, but when it was, everything had to be perfect. While the queen walked beside the king in temples, the other women existed in the shadows. But those shadows were where the real intimacy took place. Unlike the formalities of a royal marriage, the relationships between pharaohs and their lovers were often very open. Some kings had a close relationship with certain women. Others thought they could all be replaced, but all of them understood that the queen was untouchable in one sense and unavailable in another. There were also deeper layers to this structure. Many of the women in the harem were not Egyptian. They came from Nubia, Syria, the Levant, and even farther afield. They brought new languages, customs, and appearances with them. For the pharaoh, this diversity was new and exciting. This caused some tension in the court. Foreign women had no traditional claim to power, but their children did. When a son of a mistress of the king started to gain the king's trust, different groups in the palace noticed. It is strange that while the queen was a perfect example of Egyptian ideals, the real mothers of future rulers were sometimes outsiders who had no voice. People thought they were valuable because they could make others happy, help them have children, and leave when they wanted to. No statues were built to honor them. No poems were written about them. And yet, they were the ancestors of kings. This created a strange feeling of having two different ideas at the same time. On one side stood the queen, silent and tall. Her image was carved into temples as a perfect example. On the other side were the many unnamed women who made the king happy, gave him children, and kept him distracted. The distance between these roles was not physical. It was a symbol. The queen was seen as a sacred being. The concubine was necessary, but sometimes it was hard to tell the difference. Some of these women were so important to the emperor that they were treated almost like his wife. Some of them have as much influence as the queen. Their living space became more luxurious. Their sons received better teaching. Their names were written on signs. But being a member of the royal family also meant you were at risk. There were always dangers of envy, rivalry, and sabotage. The harem was not just a place of pleasure. It was a place of quiet warfare. The queen hardly ever met these women in her everyday life. She didn't need to. She was born into this position. But this protection was not always enough. Sometimes, queens were quietly ignored when a pharaoh started to show more devotion to someone else. In other cases, queens used their friends in the priesthood or administration to weaken their rivals. The drama of the palace was not always obvious, but was a constant presence in every decision and ritual. Even though the pharaoh was very powerful, he was still at the center of this quiet storm. He was surrounded by women who had different roles. He chose based on his mood, the ritual, or just out of whim. He was not expected to love his queen. He was expected to look the part. Only a few people knew what happened in the privacy of his chambers, and even fewer remembered it. At the edge of this carefully arranged world stood the servants, the scribes, and the guards. They saw everything but said nothing. They were the ones who lit the lamps, folded the robes, and recorded the births. They knew which woman was favored and which one was forgotten. And in the silence of night, as the palace went quiet, they watched new favorites rise and old ones fade. But the royal wives and chosen mistresses were very different from the other women. Women who did not come from nobility or foreign kingdoms, but from slavery, and their role in the pharaoh's desires was even more disturbing. While the king's mistresses and queens competed for position within the palace, there was yet another form of intimacy reserved only for the king. It was not shared in private. It didn't happen in hidden rooms or rooms with nice smells. Instead, it was performed in the open in front of priests, soldiers, and sometimes the public. It was a special event that was called the Divine Union. Each year, in one of the most elaborate religious ceremonies of the New Kingdom, the pharaoh was expected to perform a sacred act that mirrored the myth of Isis and Osiris. According to the story, the goddess Isis brought her dead husband Osiris back to life and had a baby with him, called Horus. This story, written on temple walls and sung in songs at festivals, was the foundation for a public rite. In this rite, the living pharaoh was seen as Osiris. And to complete the myth, a woman was chosen to become Isis. The union had to be acted out. The woman they chose was not an ordinary person. She was a high priestess. She had been trained from a young age to work in the temple. Her education included religious practices, songs, and physical discipline. But her most important role came on the day of the Divine Union. She would lie next to the pharaoh in a special temple space. Her body was covered in oils, and her limbs were arranged according to specific instructions. She wasn't just pretending to be a goddess. The audience saw her as a goddess. The place where the show was set was prepared in advance. The temple space was made clean days before. The clean linen was put on the bed. Incense burned constantly, covering up the smell of sweat and anxiety. Stone basins held perfumed water. Statues of the gods stood at the edge. The act itself, though it involved a lot of ritual, was not just symbolic. It involved touching someone. Sometimes it involved having sex with them. The idea was to recreate the divine conception to bring Horus into the world once again, even if only through performance. This event was public knowledge. The court was there. Witnesses were expected from high-ranking officials, priests, and military commanders. They were there to check things, not to have fun. If the pharaoh was to be seen as a god, the moment of the union with the divine had to be seen, accepted, and confirmed. It was one of the few times in history when being good in bed was important for being seen as a good person. The priestess involved did not choose the role. She had been prepared for it. From the moment she was chosen, her life was set on the path to this one moment. She was taught rituals as well as how to sit, breathe, and be still. Her body was part of the temple's religious services. She often remained unmarried for the rest of her life. Taking part in the divine union made her more important, but it also meant she was no longer part of normal life. In contrast to modern ceremonies, where power is transferred through words and oaths, this ritual transferred authority through physical contact. The king was not just declared to be divine, it was performed. That performance was also very physical, which most people would not be able to imagine today. In today's world, even the idea of such public affection would cause upset. In ancient Egypt, it was a source of wonder. It's hard to measure the emotional impact on those involved. The pharaoh was under a lot of pressure and had to do many important things. If you refused the ritual, you refused divinity. But if you performed it, you crossed a line that few rulers in other civilizations ever approached. The priestess had little choice. She was trained to obey, made to fit a certain mold, and then asked to carry the burden of the gods. The setting made the story even more strange. Light came through the stone slats. Scribes stood at the edge, silently recording. Priests sang songs that mixed up what was real and what was made up. Guards lined the outer courts, keeping out ordinary people while letting selected witnesses in. No one spoke loudly. Every movement was part of the performance. Every breath was carefully planned. The ritual didn't end with the act. Afterwards, the priestess was washed and left alone. The king came out wearing a new robe, often white or gold, and was taken to the next ceremony where people said he was a god. The union was declared successful. Offerings were made, feasts followed, but the most important thing was that private moment that became public, that small act that became a religious ceremony. There are temple inscriptions that show this ritual using secret symbols. Lotus flowers, snakes entwined, or birds in embrace suggest the union without describing it outright. But other records are more direct. Papyrus texts describe how to prepare, who the participants are, and what the chance is. Historians have used these to create a clearer picture. The union of the two gods was not just a story. It was just practice. Some pharaohs did this many times during their rule. Others changed the ritual to suit their own preferences or beliefs. Sometimes it was said that the priestess fell into a trance so deep that she didn't move for hours afterwards. Others were given new titles, temples, or servants. But their roles never changed. They had become living myths. And myths once lived could not be undone. What worries me most is how calm everyone was about these things. There was no scandal, no outrage. For the Egyptian elite, the human body was just another tool in the pursuit of cosmic balance. There was no divide between spirit and flesh. Everything was part of the same continuous story. It might seem strange, but the ritual actually had a real political purpose. It made the court, the priests, and the people sure that the king was not just a man. He had become one with a goddess. He had recreated the first day of creation. He was, for a moment, more than human. The ceremony may have been held every year, but its effects lasted all year. It showed that life, death, and rebirth are all part of the same cycle. This made the kingdom remember that the gods were still in control, and that their ruler had gone to the gods' world and come back with the gods' blessing. Even if he didn't really believe it himself, he had finished the performance, and that was all that mattered. When the temple doors closed and the chanting stopped, the pharaoh went back to his normal life. But for the priestess, life never quite returned to what it was. Her body had been like a stage. Her job was over. She would not be called back. In another part of the palace, the harem carried on with its quiet competition. In a different part of the building, the foreign mistresses got ready for a different kind of encounter. One that had no ceremony, no blessing, and no divine audience. The divine union was not the only time a pharaoh's body was the center of a sacred performance. There was another ritual, one that was even more personal and striking to look at, and which made it hard to tell where respect ended and discomfort began. The ceremony was different from the scene with the king and priestess, where everything was planned. This ceremony only involved the pharaoh. Instead of happening in the shadows of temple walls, it happened in full view of everyone under the open sky. Priests were chanting around him, and spectators gathered in silent attention. It was called the ritual of fertility and was basically a holy act that was done on your own. Each year when the Nile began to swell and flood the farmlands of Egypt, the people gathered to give thanks. The river's rise was not just a natural thing. It was a very kind thing to do. In their beliefs, the flooding was a sign that the earth was ready for life to grow. And just as the land needed to be prepared for planting, so too did the ritual call for the pharaoh to act. His role was to represent the male principle of the gods, the generative force, the initiator of abundance. He had to ejaculate, plain and simple. During the ceremony, the king stood on the banks of a Nile wearing simple ceremonial linen, with offerings, priests, and royal attendants around him. The chants started slowly, asking for the blessings of Hapi, the god of the Nile, and Osiris, the god of life and resurrection. As the prayers reached their highest point, the pharaoh went to the edge of the water, raised his hands, and did the act. It was not done with shame or hesitation. It was done as a gesture of fertility, a copy of a divine creation. To the people watching, this wasn't rude. It was necessary. If it doesn't, the land might stay dry. The crops might fail. The gods might not be pleased. Pharaoh's seed was seen as a direct offering when it spilled into the river or onto the soil. It was a symbol of abundance, unity, and the unbroken cycle of life. It is both amazing and strange that one man's private release could be seen as the key to an entire civilization's survival. The act was known by many names depending on the region and era. Some texts describe it as the spilling of royal essence. Others call it the moment of divine continuation. The meaning didn't change no matter how it was said. People believed that each drop had special powers. People also thought that it would wake up the spirits of the land, as if the pharaoh's actions had made the ground come alive. This ceremony is different from modern rituals of gratitude, which involve prayers, hymns, or shared meals. It is a strange mix of devotion and showing off your body. There was no curtain, and no one was modest. During the ritual, the king's body was not his own. It was a vessel for a divine purpose. And while everyone watched with serious respect, some people probably felt confused or uncomfortable, but no one said anything about it. Questioning the ritual was like questioning the river, because the river was life. The ceremony was prepared for days in advance. The pharaoh stopped eating, cleaned himself, and gave smaller offerings. The place where the ritual was held was decorated with flowers, incense, and things that represent fertility, like dates, figs, and carved lotus petals. Female dancers moved gently on the edge of the stage. The drummers played a steady rhythm, not too loud, but like a heartbeat. When the moment came, everyone was silent. The king went on stage, and the show started. There are no written records that describe exactly how the pharaoh achieved climax or how long the ritual lasted. The scribes focused on the most important points, not the small details. What mattered was that it happened. When the ceremony finished, everyone cheered. Doves were released, and sometimes water jars were lowered into the Nile to collect what was believed to be blessed by the king's essence. Some scholars debate whether the ritual was always physically performed or if it became more symbolic later on. But early records, particularly from the Old Kingdom, suggest that it was actually a literal act. One part of a temple wall talks about the king's hand rising to make plants grow. This is a poetic way of describing it, but it also makes a clear point. Another shows a person crouching near the bank, arm outstretched, moving smoothly down towards carved waves. This might seem impossible today, but in ancient Egypt, rulers would often be seen in public, even doing things like this for spiritual reasons. It was not separated into sacred and profane. It was a tool of ritual and part of religious belief. The pharaoh's hand was not just a limb. It was a divine extension. His seed was more than just his DNA. It was holy water. What surprises me most is how easily the private became public in these ancient rites. Today, we would see these actions as shameful, but at the time, they were seen as acts of religious devotion. The lines between what was real and what was believed were more blurred, and even the king, despite his power, was not immune to feeling vulnerable. At that moment, he was on his own, without any decorations, performing for gods and people. The women in the palace might have seen or heard about the ritual. They might have thought it was important or meaningful in different ways. It was a reminder of the king's unique role. Remember, even if they spent a lot of time with him, the best kind of devotion was a private one, just for themselves and the earth. No queen or mistress could replace that special moment of offering. Later dynasties changed the ritual. They moved it indoors. They gave out proxy votes. But the important parts of the ceremony were still there. The act of creation, even if it was just a gesture, was too important to give up. If we don't do this, the balance of nature and power might be upset. The waters might stay still. The gods might not be interested. Every year, when the river rose, the people waited for the king to do something special. They wanted him to connect with the land in a deep way, not through war, laws, or words, but in a way that was older than kingship itself. After that, when the music started up again and people threw offerings into the water, the pharaoh went back to the palace. He was washed, put into clean clothes, and taken through the halls, where there were lots of lily flowers and date palms. But the ceremony was still remembered by those who had seen it. The sight of a god on his own in his offering was hard to forget. Meanwhile, in other parts of the city, behind closed doors and veils, another kind of ritual was taking place. This is not something you do on your own. You do it with people who can't say no. Women chosen not for their family or looks, but for their willingness to submit. There was another rite that not many people knew about. This was far from the public rituals on the banks of the Nile, where the pharaoh's body was seen as a symbol of fertility. It wasn't written on public walls or celebrated with flowers and dances. It happened in darkness and in silence. It was about a belief so deeply connected to the fear of death and the wish for new life that even those who worked for the king did not want to talk about it. This was the ritual of awakening the dead, and its most important part was a physical union between the pharaoh and a body that was no longer considered to be alive. According to old temple texts and stories told in secret tombs, some pharaohs thought that if they could contact a dead body, it could bring a spirit that was trapped between worlds back to life. Not with a body and not any kind of contact. It had to be a woman. It was necessary to do it in a way that involved both prayer and physical penetration. The body was like a temporary home for the spirit, a way to bring it back, even if just for a short time. This belief, known among priests as the awakening rite, was said to return stolen power to the living and guide lost souls back towards the afterlife. It was not a public ceremony. The act was carried out deep within the temple or in secret underground rooms. Torches were put out. Only the oil lamps were still lit, casting a weak yellow light on the stone walls, which were marked with symbols of protection. The air smelt strongly of incense made from myrrh and frankincense. Only a small group of elder priests and servants who had been taught to keep quiet were allowed to listen. The woman who was chosen for the role was not a royal. She was often a servant or a mistress from the lower ranks of the palace. She was young, obedient, and had been trained to obey. Before the ritual, she was prepared in a special way. Her skin was covered in special oils. She was given a mouthwash made from a mixture of honey and bitter herbs. Her body was wrapped in a loose material, similar to the kind used when people are mummified. To anyone looking at her, she looked like a dead body. That was the whole point. After the ceremony, she was taken to a special room and laid on a cold stone slab. Her eyes were to stay closed. Her breathing was shallow. Her arms were resting across her chest. Then the pharaoh went in by himself. He didn't say anything. The only sound was the quiet singing of religious songs outside the room. He was there to awaken them, not in how they feel or spiritually, but physically. The body in front of him was the border between life and death. To cross that border, he had to perform the act. It is hard to say how people who are used to seeing naked people and sexual acts as part of a religious ceremony would react to this. The act itself was seen as part of a larger cycle in the universe. Just as Osiris had been cut into pieces and put back together by Isis, and then brought back to life one last time. This rite also showed the story of resurrection. It was not intimacy. It was called restoration, which is different to modern spiritual practices like using candles, breathing techniques, or meditation. This was something colder, heavier, and far more unsettling. The priests did not see this as a violation of the temple. They saw it as a way to call something into existence. To them, the body was not sacred in itself, but in its ability to act as a vessel. The dead were not gone. They were paused. If you do the right things at the right time, they might come back. No one outside the chosen inner circle ever witnessed these rites. Even within the temple hierarchy, knowledge of them was restricted. Some records suggest that these rituals were only performed during times of major political uncertainty, when Omen said that the connection between worlds had been broken. By doing the right thing, the pharaoh showed that he could make things peaceful in his kingdom and between the living and the dead. The woman's name was never recorded. She was not honored or thanked. After the act, she was taken out of the chamber and put in seclusion. Sometimes, she was never seen again. We don't know if she was killed, sent away, or just forgotten. Some researchers think that the ritual itself was harmful to her mentally, and that the fact that nobody spoke about it was a way of hiding both a role in it and the trauma she went through. What we have left are only a few mentions here and there. A priest's manual has a broken line in it. There is also a painted figure lying on stone. She has her eyes shut and her arms crossed. There is a note about oil being poured on both bodies before they are joined. These fragments suggest something real, something hidden behind the stories of divine kingship and good public behavior. It was not about beauty or passion. It was all about control. What worries me most is how quiet it is. The idea that someone could lie there, fully aware, pretending to be dead, while the most powerful man in the land was enacting a drama written by priests long before either of them was born. It was not a desire. It was something he felt he had to do. The king did not do it for fun. He did it because his advisors told him that the kingdom needed it, that the gods required it, that without it, the spirits would wander endlessly and the fields would not bloom. The symbolism was strong, but the human cost was not clear. The body became a tool, and the soul was less important. But for the ancient Egyptians, this was not seen as wrong. It was seen as a very important place. People were so afraid of death and so sure that life needed a change that they almost made the line between the living and the dead disappear. When the ritual finished, the room was closed off. The king went back to his own private rooms. The priest put out the lamps and swept the floor with bundles of reeds. No one spoke about what had happened, but everyone still believed it. The spark had been reignited, a soul had been touched, and the kingdom had been cleansed in some strange and difficult way. This ritual was rare, but there would be more like it. In other parts of the palace, other acts of physical submission were being practiced, but these involved women who were still alive, women who had no special status in religion, no stories about them that were considered holy, and no choice in what was expected of their bodies. In a culture where the pharaoh could lie with a dead body to bring about cosmic restoration, it would seem that few boundaries remained. But not every act of sexuality was encouraged without restraint. There were limits, and these were enforced with quiet but powerful conviction. One of these rules was for men, especially royal men. The words were simple, but what they meant was not. No man was ever allowed to bleed during sex. People used to think that male blood was impure and that it was a sign of bad things. This idea came from both religion and the way people used symbols. In ancient Egyptian rituals, men were seen as the creators, the sources of life, and the ones in control. It was meant to flow inward or be released deliberately, not to escape through injury or rupture. Female bleeding, especially menstrual blood, was also seen with caution, but it had its place in the natural cycles of fertility. However, male blood does not have this cycle. If it appeared, something had gone wrong. This view was common among the elite, especially the royal family. It included all types of intimacy, including heterosexual, homosexual, and ceremonial acts. Any encounter that risked breaking skin or causing discomfort was not recommended. This was not about being kind. It was taught as a set of rules. A bleeding man was seen as someone who had lost control of his body. And control was the most important part of being a king. Because of this, sexual practices had to change. The positions were changed. People were given new roles. In some cases, when men were involved in rituals together, including pharaohs and their closest male friends, the rituals were designed to be less physically demanding. They avoided doing things that might be normal in other places. The priests were clear. If blood touched the linens, the chamber had to be purified. If blood touched the floor, it was a stain on the ritual. What is important is not the ban itself, but the worry behind it. The idea that a single drop of blood could disrupt the cosmic balance suggests a deep vulnerability beneath the grandeur. The male body is often seen as strong and powerful, but it is also seen as delicate and pure. A small break could cause spiritual problems. It could lead to an environment where people are less comfortable expressing their emotions, compared to modern attitudes which emphasize consent, communication, and emotional safety. This old way of thinking was based on a hidden system of rules about the body. The goal was not to feel good or to understand things, but to survive. The royal family had to be very careful to avoid anything that could make them impure, because being impure was a risk they could not afford to take. This worry had a big effect on life at the palace, but in a small and ongoing way. People like guards, servants, and scribes were taught to check the health of the pharaoh's closest family and servants. If a male companion looked hurt, he was moved away from the area. If a servant got a cut or wound, Even if it wasn't related to sex, they might be moved to work in the temple or do easier tasks. There was no room for uncertainty. Blood didn't just stain the fabric. It was seen as something that was not very good in terms of men being close to each other. This fear created an odd situation. While it was not unusual for pharaohs to have such relationships, the actions themselves had to be strictly controlled. If penetration was performed at all, it was only a little bit deep and was controlled. Sometimes they used substitutes. People used objects made from polished ivory or soft stone carved with symbolic shapes instead. These objects were considered safer, cleaner, and easier to manage. It was also common to give men special roles during rituals. One of these roles was to sit quietly and receive breath. This is also called the receiver of breath. This title suggested spiritual submission rather than physical dominance. The dance was choreographed to highlight the symbolic transfer of energy rather than focusing on physical pleasure. The goal was to bring people together, not to create a climax. What I find most interesting is how the fear of contamination shaped not just rules, but behaviors and identities. It wasn't shameful to be penetrated, but it was shameful to bleed. If they showed any signs of damage, it was seen as a sign of weakness. In a system where weakness was not accepted, men learned to hide, adapt, and sometimes not do things. This even applied to grooming. Men in the royal family, especially those who had important jobs, were checked by doctors all the time. They had shaved their skin. Their nails were trimmed. The palace healers checked for any cuts or swelling. Ointments made from beeswax and lotus resin were used to stop chafing or infection. A whole science was built around the idea of silence. Its goal was to protect the male body. Sometimes, priests made sure that people followed these rules. Before certain ceremonies, they checked the participants not just for cleanliness, but for signs of bleeding too. Even a small cut on your lip could get you fired. The focus on seamless flesh became part of a larger obsession with uninterrupted order. Just as a chipped statue needed to be restored, the body needed to be kept whole. These restrictions might seem a bit much, even like they're trying to control us too much. But they were consistent with a worldview that feared disorder above all. Egypt was a land built on the rhythm of the Nile, on the certainty of cycles. Anything that didn't fit into this pattern was seen as suspicious, and nothing was more disruptive than uncontrolled bodily fluids. This belief also affected how punishments were given. When a male servant or consort was disciplined, it was done with soft things like wooden rods wrapped in linen, flat paddles carved from palm wood, or bundles of reeds soaked in water. The goal was to bruise, not cut. It was okay to feel pain. Blood was not. A bleeding servant was a problem. A noble who was seen to be bleeding could cause a scandal. Even the tombs show this. Male mummies were often wrapped more carefully. Special resins were used to seal the skin. The surgeon made small cuts to remove the internal organs. People used to think that when a man died, his body should be returned to the earth in the same condition it was in when he was alive. If you arrived in the afterlife with a cut or open wound, you were considered impure. This is why the rituals continued. They were still close, but always with someone watching. A kingdom ruled by gods did not allow weakness, even in the form of the human body. The pharaoh felt powerful because he believed that no one could touch or harm his body. But not everyone in the palace could pay for that. In the outer halls, away from the perfume chambers and polished stone baths, there were other bodies, foreign bodies, unprotected ones. They bled when they were touched, and no one stopped to clean it. While the royal men were protected by many rules to stop them from getting hurt, other people in the palace system were not given the same protection. For them, the body had no limits. There was no protection, no inspection, and no priest to stop a violation. The slaves working in the temples were some of the most silent people in this complex structure. This was particularly true of the women who were chosen to perform a role that is not often written about in official history. They weren't there to clean, chant, or light incense. They were offered to statues of gods as containers for the gods' energy at several holy sites, especially those dedicated to gods of fertility like Min or Hathor. Rituals involved the physical presence of female slaves whose role was to awaken or maintain the divine energy of the god's image. The statue itself, often made from stone or wood and covered in gold leaf, stood at the center of the sanctuary. It was a picture of the god, not just a symbol, but a living force. And for that force to stay strong, it had to be aroused. To do this, women were chosen and taught how to stand, how to breathe, and how to stay still for long periods. Their clothes, if you could call them that, were made from see-through linen soaked in oil to stick to the skin. Their hair was perfumed and shaped into coils. Their bodies were positioned in certain ways. They were often standing with their hips forward, arms raised, or legs slightly apart. These stances were not random. They followed a script that only the temple keepers knew. Each pose represented a different feeling or mood. These women weren't allowed to speak during the ceremony. They were told to look at the statue, not away from it. They did not flinch or move, even when the air grew cold or insects landed on their skin. They were expected to become like living reflections of a god's desires. The priest called them receivers of presence. The term suggested a passive role, but the reality was more active, more invasive, and more long-lasting than the word implies. What strikes me most is how still these women were. They weren't just meditating, they were performing a complete surrender. They were required to embody not devotion, but invitation. They had to make it clear that they were available, that they had no will of their own, and that their presence was a gift. Today, religious rites are often symbolized by things like candles or chants. But in the past, people actually used human bodies as tools of worship. There were no metaphors. The message was physical. The gods did not just want food and incense to be offered to them. They needed some excitement. This feeling came from those who could not speak. At some festivals, the acts were more than just a symbol. In some very rare and worrying cases written in secret temple records, priests touched the women to send divine energy to them. The logic was always the same. The god's spirit entered the statue. The statue's desire was passed on to the priest. The priest's touch made it happen. In this way of thinking, consent was no longer important. Not every temple did this. Not every era was the same. But where it happened, it was recorded formally, never shamefully. One scroll from a temple in Thebes describes the time when the god becomes restless. It also gives a list of poses and positions for the slave attendants. Another list is split into pieces. Names of women are written next to dates and locations. It looks like they are part of an inventory. There are no prayers for their safety and no rituals for their return. The most disturbing thing may be how quiet it is. These women were not considered to be taking part. They were considered tools. The priest who put them in front of the statue did not speak to them. The guards who watched did not get involved. The other temple staff did not let him in. This silence became part of the ritual. People thought that noise would distract the god. Only the sound of drums or low flutes filled the room. Everything else was still. After the ceremony, the women were taken back into isolation. Some were immersed in salt water to remove divine residue. Others were left unwashed, as if to keep the connection going. People only got medical care if they were taken to hospital after collapsing. In some temples, people who fainted during the ritual were thought to be too mortal and were permanently removed. They became useless as soon as their body stopped working. It is hard not to see this practice as the collapse of spirituality into exploitation, where devotion became the same as abuse. The belief that gods have a lot of hunger was very important to Egyptian beliefs, and this allowed these acts to continue. The god wanted. The statue was received. The woman did what she was told. These temple slaves were not always from Egypt. Many were taken from lands that had been conquered. Their foreignness added to the mystery. Priests believed that women from distant regions held different energies, perhaps more powerful or more open to influence. Their skin felt strange. Their tongues are foreign. They look exotic, so are perfect for working in a church. Nothing about their background mattered once they were chosen. They were renamed. Their paths were erased. Their roles are defined entirely by ritual. Even their periods were monitored, not for health reasons, but to help with scheduling. A woman who bled was considered unclean. The best person for the job would be a woman who has ovulated. They were moved from one temple to another, or sometimes loaned between cities, depending on what the god wanted and how confident the priests were. But we don't know anything about them. No statue was raised for them. No tomb honored their service. They were not wives, queens, or mistresses. People believed that the gods looked at her hands, hips, and breasts. When the ritual finished, they disappeared behind veils, and others took their place. The pharaoh himself hardly ever went to these ceremonies. His role in temple life was more symbolic and more distant, but he approved the structure that allowed them. His priests did what he wanted. His silence made it okay. This mix of worship and violation led to a place where belief could excuse almost anything. The women were not thought to have been harmed. They were thought to be honored just to be touched by a god, even if that wasn't the intention. But the body remembers the muscles that trembled from hours of stillness, the lungs that held breath in the smoke of incense. The eyes looked into the hollow eyes of a golden statue. These women carried the weight of gods, not in crowns or titles, but in silence. Outside the temple, other rituals were happening. These were less formal, but still controlled. The goal there wasn't to bring out some kind of spiritual energy, but to make something, and for that, even blood ties were no longer a barrier. In the innermost sanctums where temple slaves were offered as sacrifices to statues, belief often overpowered hesitation. In some rare and private rituals, belief went even further. There were ceremonies that were so secret and controversial that even within the Egyptian priesthood, only a few people knew about them. These were not public shows or royal displays. They are part of an older way of thinking about religion, which focused on the most basic aspects of fertility. At the heart of some of these rites was the idea of a sacred union with animals, which is almost impossible to understand today. To understand how such an idea could have started, we need to think about the importance of animals in Egyptian religion. The gods themselves were often shown with animal heads. The bull was a symbol of strength and power. Donkeys were seen as strong and stubborn. Cats, crocodiles, and falcons each had special powers. Statues were not just carved to look like these creatures. People also believed that the animals themselves carried pieces of the gods. A bull chosen by the temple could be more than a beast. It could be the physical container of a deity. Ceremonies involving animals were not common. These events did not happen in every city or temple. But some surviving texts and stories told by word of mouth suggest that in isolated areas, particularly during seasonal fertility festivals, there were rituals where people took part in acts meant to show the union of nature and divinity. These were not crimes that were punished in the ancient world. They were seen as holy representations of the forces that make life happen. The people taking part were never ordinary people. They were temple specialists, often women who had been raised within the religious system from childhood. Some were called divine attendants. Others were considered to be less important priests. In public rites, they sang, danced, or performed cleansing duties. But in these secret ceremonies, their jobs were different. Their bodies became tools for calling the gods. What makes this even more disturbing is that it was not random or chaotic. It was carefully planned, timed, and performed under supervision. The temple prepared the space. The animal was chosen and made clean. The person taking part in the ritual fasted, was covered in milk and honey, and was rubbed with lotus oil. The robes were taken off. The animal was tied down, and then the act was carried out. Symbolic fertility rites in other ancient cultures involved imitation or suggestion, but this went further than what modern ethics can accept. The union was not a metaphor. People thought it would create a field of energy to stimulate the ground and recreate the moment when God first brought flesh and breath into being. No one was allowed to watch, but a small group of older priests and temple scribes stood nearby. Their presence was not in any way inappropriate. It was official. Their job was to confirm that the ritual had been done correctly. These rites were often connected to the cycle of farming, the start of the planting season, the arrival of the floods, or a solar event. The argument was repetitive. The god lives in the animal. The priestess joins with the animal. The god is awakened through her. The land reacts. Crops grow. Balance is restored. The animal was never killed afterwards. That would be wrong. It was usually kept alone, given special food, and watched closely. It became very important because God and people had both touched it. In some temples, these animals were buried with honors. They were wrapped in linen and placed in tombs with sacred relics. There is no record of the women involved having agreed to this or having tried to stop it. We don't know their names. Their experiences are not described. What we have left are just the clinical records of what they were supposed to do. A stone relief from a temple in a remote province shows a woman kneeling before a creature with a horn on its head. She looks calm. Her body is shaped into curves and angles like the gods themselves. Another shows a donkey surrounded by symbols of fertility, rhythm, and breath. These images are rare and difficult to find, hidden in lower walls, almost as if they were meant to be forgotten. The priests who created these rituals described them as restorations, not violations. They said that the world had become too dry and that only the oldest rites could make it green again. These were desperate actions that were dressed up as religious beliefs. The earth needed to be shocked into blooming. The gods had to be woken up. To do that, we had to go beyond what was possible for humans. What worries me is that these rituals were kept in a way that was planned, not as stories, but as instructions. They were not figurative in the first place. They were treated with the same seriousness as burial rites or coronations. The difference was that they happened out of sight. Only a small network knew about them, and they were passed from one generation to the next. Over time, the ceremonies became less important as Egypt changed, with new dynasties and foreign influences. These acts were first hidden in metaphors, then in reality. The scrolls describing them were lost or destroyed. The temples that housed them collapsed. The people involved in the story are not named, but their actions and words still echo. There are pieces of writing and some drawings that are not finished. In later texts, Vega is described as the union of the beast and the vessel. These remnants show that in the past, the sacred and the profane were not opposites, but rather close together. This meant that faith could be stretched to justify things that would not be possible otherwise. The women who took part were not called victims. They were called chosen, and that title made everything else seem unimportant. The Pharaoh himself rarely took part in these ceremonies, but he approved of them. He gave them the money. He agreed to the training of the priestesses. By doing this, he allowed the line between human and animal worship and submission to be crossed in the name of life itself. Although these rites were no longer officially recognized in the temples, their spirits still existed. In other parts of the palace, new ways to make sure the king and queen could have children were thought of. The methods didn't involve animals, but blood. This blood wasn't from ritual creatures, but from the most guarded female bodies in the royal household. As rituals involving sacred animals became more secret, another set of practices remained a normal part of the daily life of the palace. These events did not take place in far-off temples or with elite priests watching. They happened in bedrooms, in bathrooms, in small bowls hidden behind silk curtains. They focus on a substance that has always been seen differently in every culture: menstrual blood. The ancient Egyptians thought of blood differently. It was life, will, and power in human form. When it flowed from a wound, it was a sign that someone was weak. When it was spilled in battle, it was a sign of sacrifice. But menstrual blood was in a different category. It was a monthly reminder of what life could be like, but it also made her feel left out. In religious terms, it was often seen as dirty. But in the palace, among certain queens and chosen priestesses, it became something else entirely, a way to control people. Some texts describe the belief that the blood of a virgin or royal woman had special qualities. It was said to have raw, wild energy, able to make men want it and show them hidden parts of their mind. If you collect it at the right time and mix it with wine, it could become a special drink that is very strong and persuasive. This mixture was not given out in a public ceremony. It was given in private, often disguised, and sometimes used just before a night of intimacy. The king or prince would drink from the cup, not knowing what was in it, or maybe he did know and was in on it. The idea wasn't just to deceive. It was spiritual. The blood was believed to represent fertility that had not yet become life, but had the power to create it. When combined with alcohol, this essence was activated, made fluid, and made ready to enter the body of a man. It would not make him pregnant, but it would make him feel connected to the woman who gave it to him. What makes this belief especially surprising is the change it created in a world where men controlled almost all the important positions. This ritual gave women an advantage. They could affect kings without using words. But through biology, their bodies became sources of manipulation, not just for making babies. The queen who provided the blood became more than a wife. She became a source of influence that extended far beyond the bedroom, compared to modern practices of seduction or cosmetic enhancement. This was less common, less symbolic, and more direct. There was no perfume, no dance, no veil, just the body. And the idea that what had gone could come back through someone else's mouth and change their thoughts. Some queens are said to have taken this even further. Instead of mixing the blood into drinks, they bathed in it. According to old temple scrolls and medical papyri, the practice involved collecting the monthly blood of virgins or chosen mistresses and mixing it with warm water and oils. The queen would then go for up to an hour. This was not a cleansing bath. It was all about taking in information. The aim was to regain their power and take back what they had lost. People thought it would make them more attractive, boost their sex appeal, and protect them from rivals. There is no proof that these baths were common. They needed time, secrecy, and resources. The collection itself involved everyone working together secretly. Young girls were chosen for this, often without knowing why. Servants collected the blood using strips of linen, then soaked and rubbed them over clay basins. The material was burned afterwards to stop other people using it. The bath was prepared quietly. The room was dark. No mirrors were allowed. Only the light from the oil lamps flickered along the tiled walls. The queen would go in alone, sometimes with just one attendant who also had a blindfold on. She took off her robe slowly and got into the reddish water, breathing in the smell of metal, rose petals, and myrrh. She didn't say anything. She closed her eyes, and for a short time she believed herself safe. No songs were written about this ritual. No fresco has been recorded. But the impact of this story continued to be felt in court stories and in the secret stories passed between generations of female servants. They spoke of queens who kept their position for longer than others, whose eyes made even the pharaoh hesitate, and whose voices echoed louder despite speaking less. What I find most interesting is how these private actions had real-life consequences for public life. A king might change his mind, a general might not be allowed in, a mistress might leave, and no one could say why. But the queen's gaze spoke volumes. Some scholars have tried to say that these practices are just legends. They say that such rituals are unlikely and proven or exaggerated. But ancient Egyptian culture was based on the idea that the lines between gods and men, between myth and rule, and between the physical and spiritual were not clear. In a world that always needs to be neat and tidy, it's easy to imagine that a woman might find a way to show that she has power. Even the idea of purity in Egyptian thought was flexible. One priest said it was impure, while another said it was sacred. Menstrual blood was on that line. It could mean that a woman couldn't do temple work, but it would make her more important to people who believed in its hidden strength. This was not an accident. It allowed women to have a say in the running of the country. You can never be sure of your safety. There is no record of how the men felt about this. There are no writings that express disgust or desire. But the silence itself says a lot. In a kingdom where rituals and omens were important, a king who drank from the cup could not say what he had swallowed. Saying it made it seem less serious. Ignoring it would just make it stronger. These rituals were usually only performed inside the palace. They weren't for ordinary women, the market, or the village. They were in the fancy parts of the building, the marble floors, the scented corridors, and within those walls, power moved quietly in the smells and in liquids that were too secret to name. But behind closed doors, something else was happening. A new ritual, louder and more dramatic, had started to change how death and sexuality could mix again, not with liquids, but with silence and stillness. While some royal women used secret potions and special baths to show their power while the pharaoh was alive, others were asked to do something very strange right at the moment of the pharaoh's death. In ancient Egypt, death was not a sudden event, but a transition. The body was not just ready to be buried. It was accompanied. And among the many rituals that were held when a royal died, there was one that was different because it was personal, it was big, and it was quiet. It was called the warming of the soul. The ritual began when the pharaoh's final breath was confirmed. His body was not taken straight away to be cut up. Instead, it was placed on a special platform, washed with oil, and surrounded by flowers and myrrh, which is a type of perfume. The attendants made sure that there were no men in the room. Only some women were allowed to enter, and they were told to take off their clothes. Not just a few, but dozens. The idea behind this mass disrobing was not just a symbol. People thought that the warmth of the female body and its natural connection to life and making babies could help the soul adjust. The recently departed spirit, feeling confused and not wanting to leave, might start its journey if it felt the familiar pull of pleasure, sadness, and desire. In this view, the body was not a dead body. It was a vessel suspended between two realms, and the women became the bridge. The people taking part included royal mistresses, palace servants, and sometimes even noble daughters sent by allied families. They had all been well prepared for this role before it happened. They were taught to express sadness in a particular way, moaning, rocking, and swaying to the rhythm. But with the sadness came another message: touch, whisper, and stimulate. Some of them were chosen to lie next to the dead body, with their skin touching. One or two of them were guided to stand over the body, moving slowly with their eyes closed and without making a sound. What I notice most is the mix of sadness and closeness in this place, where feelings and traditions became the same. These women were not showing affection. They were offering to take them somewhere. People thought that a dead king might not want to leave if his body was still cold. But if it was warmed by human contact, if it was surrounded by familiar things and the scent of life, the soul might loosen its grip and rise. Modern funerals separate the physical from the ceremonial, but this rite brought them together into one strange moment. There were no prayers from a distance, no hands folded in silence. Everything happened straight away. The tears were real. The touch was planned. The heat of the living was given to the dead. The descriptions of the ritual come from a book. Today, only small parts of this book are left. It is known as the Book of Divine Rebirth. It is written on the walls of tombs and carved into columns in temples. It refers to the gathering of the body's breath. This process involves female mourners encircling the king and calling the soul with their warmth. One line, which is slightly damaged but still easy to read, tells the women to move quietly, to remind the flesh of its journey. Another warns not to stop until the skin feels cold again, which is a sign that the spirit has gone. There is no mention of men taking part. The men's role in the ritual was to get ready and protect. They made the women go in. They stood guard outside. They lit the lamps, but they did not see the act itself. This was a rite of women, both sensual and sacred, hidden from male eyes and recorded only in symbols. The room where this happened was never used again. After the ritual, the body was taken to the embalming table. The room was sealed. Sometimes it was destroyed. The women were taken away, and everyone was quiet. Some of them came back, but others were no longer listed. Sometimes, names of women are written next to the title, "She Who Warmed the Throne." It was a phrase that was quite powerful, but it didn't explain anything more. The ritual was not seen as wrong. It was seen as necessary. Just as the Pharaoh had entered the world through a woman's body, he would exit the world surrounded by them. The body was dead, but the act wasn't about bringing it back to life. It was about guidance. One final push from the world of mortals into the world of gods. There are no pictures of this ceremony. No temple murals show the act, but some old stories mention it in secret language. The chamber of return, the circle of open breath, the night of unveiled sorrow. Each phrase hints at a practice that was never public, but never forgotten. What worries me is not the ritual itself, but how calmly it was part of the change in the royal family. The women weren't forced, but it was expected that they would do what they were asked. They had practiced, but they were touching a body that did not respond. They were performing for the sake of the performance itself, not for the pleasure it brought them. It is difficult to know how they felt. There are no words left for them to speak, only instructions that someone else carved. The rite was also obsessed with continuity, like much of Egyptian society. Death was a problem. Touching each other was a reminder of what they had lost. When they recreated it, even for a short time, they felt whole again. When you are at home, you feel safe and happy. The state continued. The world did not break apart after the body was taken out. The women didn't talk to each other about what they had done. The ritual was a turning point. Once crossed, it stayed there. But its energy was carried into the burial, into the tomb, and into the stories that priests whispered and that were written in ink that faded more slowly than memory. Outside the tomb, the living got ready for the next reign. A new pharaoh would soon take the throne, and with him, the cycle of sacred intimacy would begin again. This time, it was in the blood of his first wife. A union that by tradition would not involve a stranger, but someone born of the same womb. When a pharaoh died, their power was passed on to someone new, and the whole palace was rebuilt. The new ruler brought new rituals, new jobs, and often new women into the royal household. These women did not arrive with any fanfare. They didn't walk through golden arches or ride in perfumed litters. Most of them came quietly through side gates, guided by senior attendants and wearing plain linen. They came not as wives or mistresses, but as servants offered by noble families or collected from surrounding provinces. Before they could take up any task, however simple, they faced a ritual that defined the start of their life inside the palace. It was called the unveiling. As soon as they stepped into the courtyard, their names were recorded, their clothes were removed, and they stood naked in the sun or under stone ceilings, looking down. The inspection was not done by soldiers or male officials. The queen was in charge, and she was helped by senior female priests. These priests did both medical and religious roles. These women did not smile. They did not offer comfort. They moved with skill and confidence. The first purpose of the ritual was to make people pure. Each girl was checked to see if they had been sexually active. This did not always mean a physical examination. Sometimes it was clear from how they looked or acted, or from how they reacted to being touched. In other cases, more direct methods were used. Linen soaked in special oil was pressed against their thighs. We check how quickly they breathed. The judges gave them marks, which were then recorded, but virginity was not the only thing they were judging. The body itself was studied to see if it was suitable. The priest thought that some of these forms were better for the palace gods. Wide hips were seen as a sign that a woman could get pregnant. Having a straight posture showed that someone was disciplined. People thought that certain facial proportions showed balance, which was an important quality for people working in temples. Even skin tone was important, not for beauty, but for the symbolism connected to certain statues or shrines. What makes this ritual particularly disturbing is how it turned the female body into a surface for measuring power, either allowing it to be shown or stopping it. The girls were not judged as people. They were judged as instruments, either suitable for service or in need of redirection. Compared to how employers check up on job applicants these days, this process was very physical, immediate, and irreversible. If a girl is thought to have even one flaw, it can ruin her chances in life. There was no appeal, no discussion, and no protection. Those who passed the inspection were taken into a separate hall. There, they wore the usual palace robes, were taught how to move and to be quiet, and were given small jobs to do. Some people worked with incense. Others cleaned ceremonial tools. Some of them were trained as dancers or singers. They might get a promotion and be allowed to go into the inner rooms where they will be close to the ruler. Those who failed were not expelled. They were sent to a different page. Most of these were given to the temple departments that looked after the statues of the gods. These girls did not live in the palace. They were moved to smaller cities and put into temple annexes. Their role changed completely. They were trained not to serve humans, but to please carved representations of deities. This was not about standing beside the statue with offerings. It meant acting as containers of divine energy. The same rituals described in earlier temple practices were also used here. They wore see-through robes, stood still for hours on end, and sometimes touched each other. This was organized by senior priests. The girl was no longer a servant. She was a medium. People used to think that her body was not good enough for the palace, but it became a way for people to believe that gods get attention and energy. No one came back from that path. After that, the girl's name was changed in the temple records. Her family did not know. Sometimes, if a girl was very beautiful or friendly, her picture was kept in sketches that were hidden deep inside temple scrolls. These images were not portraits. They were pictures of how people were standing, what they were looking at, and how they were sitting or standing. So the first unveiling was more than just a test. It was a difficult decision. One moment of weakness can change everything. The girl who trembled might be seen as weak. If someone is still and doesn't move much, they might be thought of as cold. The review wasn't scientific. It was spiritual. The body was read like a text, and every scar, every blemish, every silence was interpreted. Some accounts say that the queen hardly ever spoke during these inspections. Her presence was a reminder that women in the palace had just as much power as men, even if they weren't in charge. She did not protect the girls. She kept the structure the same. After the inspection, the girls were not comforted. They were washed again, this time with cold water. They didn't say anything. Their old clothes, which were often their last connection to the outside world, were burned. What was left was a body, clean, anonymous, and ready to serve. What bothers me most is not the exposure, but the silence that followed it. Nobody wrote down how the girls felt. Nobody wrote down what they were thinking. The ritual was seen as normal, important, and even holy. But we will never fully understand the emotional impact of what these young women go through when they are stripped and inspected by strangers. This made people realize something important about the Egyptian court. Power did not always come from titles or bloodlines. It came from being close, and being close began with being able to get there. It was a big deal to be allowed inside the palace. But that came at a cost. For many girls, the price was their freedom. Once inside, their bodies no longer belonged to them. They are part of a system that evaluated them, sent them elsewhere, and then consumed them based on needs that they did not understand. Some people made changes, while others quietly got lost in the world of rituals. This unveiling ritual was not the only one. It was one of many things that happened to women's bodies in ancient Egypt. And in the next room, there was another test waiting. This test did not involve inspection, judgment, or choice. It only involved obeying instructions, using one candle and a man in robes who had the power to approve or condemn. The new palace servants were not the only people whose bodies were shown and whose futures decided in silence. Beyond the palace walls, in the quiet corridors of temple complexes, a different kind of initiation took place. It had nothing to do with royal blood, a throne, or a golden mask, but it was just as important. In ancient Egyptian temples, where being a priest was the most important job, you didn't become a priest just because you knew a lot or believed in God. The change needed proof, and that proof came in the form of flesh. Before a man could officially join the priesthood, he had to take part in a ritual known as the joining of souls. This ritual is mentioned in the Inner Temple Scrolls. The act that took place between a male candidate and a senior female priestess was not symbolic. It was physical, it was sexual, and it was considered essential to strip the man of his mortal confusion and align him with sacred purpose. The man would be taken into a private room after a few basic cleanings. He had not eaten or drunk anything for several days, had repeatedly been washed in salt water, and had not spoken for 24 hours. His head was shaved and his body was oiled. He wore only a narrow linen wrap and carried a single lotus flower in one hand. The woman who met him was not a stranger. She was a senior priestess who had already completed decades of service. Her body was old, but that was the point. She had lost sight of her own identity. She was the goddess in all her glory, not young or sexy, but wise and everlasting. Her role was not to receive pleasure, but to give it to others. She was in control of the act, not with kindness, but with confidence. The room where the ritual happened had been carefully set up. Cushions lined the stone floor, and lamps burned with thick blue smoke. Symbols of the goddess Hathor were carved into the walls. There was no music, no prayer, and no audience at first. Only one person entered after the act had begun, a temple scribe with a reed brush and a roll of papyrus. It's hard to imagine this ritual, because it made intimacy seem like something you should be able to erase. The man was not allowed to speak, express a desire, or question anything. He was not aroused by personal reasons. It was demanded. The priestess was not there as a partner. She was there to help people change. They did something together that the priest called the exchange of boundaries. Today, when people join a religion, they make promises or do symbolic acts. But in the past, this ceremony involved giving up all control over one's body to show that one was aligned with the spirit world. The man was seen as a lay person when he did this. After reaching the highest point, he was expected to cry not because he was feeling emotional, but because he was letting go of his ego. If he stayed calm, the ritual wasn't considered complete. The person writing, who was sitting a short distance away, did not write down the words. He outlined the act. He was able to draw the shape of the body, where the limbs were placed, and the order of the movements. These sketches were not kept as art. They were stored as proof. If people start to question the man's spiritual integrity in the future, we can show them the scroll to prove that he followed the right procedure. In some temples, these scrolls were kept for many years. In other cases, they were burned right away after the candidate was accepted as a final offering to the gods. But no one ever spoke about the moment again. It became a memory shared only between the priest, the priestess, and the silent scribe whose brush documented the transformation. The ritual had to be done. If they refused, they would be permanently excluded from temple service. If they don't, they might be sent to work on a farm or as a guard. His name would be removed from the training lists. In extreme cases, he would be made to work on the temple grounds. No punishment was given and no explanation was given, only silence. Some candidates did not try to resist, but did not do the job. In these cases, temple healers were called to give herbal stimulants. If they did not get excited, they were marked as spiritually blocked and dismissed. The idea that being physically ready meant being approved by God was common. If a body was weak, it was seen as a sign that the soul was not yet ready to serve. The priestess who did the ritual did not change roles. She kept her job. She continued with her daily tasks, leading chants, interpreting omens, and overseeing sacrifices. The act did not make her a better person. It was part of her job, and she wasn't allowed to talk about it if she found it unpleasant or painful. The ritual required both participants to be detached. What I find most interesting is the amount of bureaucracy involved in something as personal as this. The presence of documents, appointments, and post-it notes made something human turn into a form of administration. The body became a list of things to do. The soul became a requirement, and the act itself became a transaction that was remembered only as data. We don't know where this ritual came from. Some people think it started during the Middle Kingdom, when the temple hierarchy became more organized. Others think it comes from older ideas about fertility that were later included in priestly culture, no matter where it started. By the time of the New Kingdom, it had become a formal part of the religious beliefs. Each big temple had a room for this. Priests from every class included men who had been through the class. There are no records of any woman refusing to perform the rite. They all took part because they felt they had to, because it was expected of them, or because they really wanted to. The younger priests did not talk about it with each other. They were told that talking about it would reduce its importance, and that remembering it too clearly meant it had not worked. But even though there was no sound, the ritual had an effect, not on the body, but on how people behaved. Men who had passed the rite often moved more slowly. They looked down. They held their hands close to their bodies. Some people looked at the priestess with fear, others with respect, but always with a sense of separation. The rite was useful. It broke the man, not as a punishment, but to get him ready. The ego was removed. What was left was a vessel ready to carry incense, to interpret dreams, and to enter temple space without carrying the stink of personal ambition. And once they had gone through that door, another one was waiting for them. It's a ritual with no priestess, no plan, and no privacy. The only things he had to deal with were the young man, a mirror, and a sharp object that he would have to use against himself without making a sound. The priesthood required men to give up their own lives before touching sacred ground. But for those born into the royal family, the pressure was even greater. Temple initiates were stripped of their identity through ritual, while princes were shaped from birth to serve one purpose. It was not used for governance or warfare. It was a reproduction, not with anyone they wanted, but with women who were related to them. The most important job in the royal household was to make sure the royal family kept going. The pharaoh was more than just a ruler. He was like a god in human form. Because people thought that gods got married to their sisters, royal heirs were expected to look inside themselves when choosing a spouse. This meant that they might choose a sister, half-sister, aunt, or cousin who was born from the same family. These were not random unions. They were deliberate, planned, and made stronger by law, stories, and buildings. People did not think it was shameful for siblings to get married into the royal family. It was seen as a prestigious place. The closer the blood, the purer the line. It was seen as the ultimate act of devotion to the divine order to have a child with a sister. These children were not thought to be dangerous. They were seen as perfect. They were shown seated beside their parents. They have tiny crowns resting on their heads. People wrote about how good their eyes, posture, and breathing were. They were not babies. They were symbols. The pressure to have a child like this was especially strong on the first son. From a young age, he was paired with one or more of his sisters. They all went to school together, ate together, and slept in the same rooms. They had been paired up before either of them had reached maturity. Servants were told to watch how they spoke to people. Priests offered blessings as soon as they saw signs of affection. Their first union was part of a bigger ritual. This included offerings and chants. This practice is especially difficult to understand because of the way it was seen as normal in the royal court. The idea of incest, as we understand it today, simply did not exist. There were no limits, no warnings, and no hesitation. The sisters were just as ready as the brothers. It wasn't about what they liked or didn't like. It was meant to be. In modern monarchies, alliances are often formed between families and regions. However, in ancient Egypt, the royal court was very closed off from other families and regions. Getting married to a queen from another country was dangerous. When a king married a commoner, it meant that the king was no longer seen as divine. The answer that was given over and over again was to keep the circle closed. But not every child born to these couples was healthy. Over time, the genetic effects of repeated inbreeding became clear. Some royal babies were born with obvious problems. Others died before they reached their first year. Some of the problems they found included clubbed feet, fused toes, elongated skulls, and problems with thinking. But even these children were honored in death. Their small tombs were decorated with the same respect given to adult kings. One time, a child who lived only a few weeks was mummified, wrapped in linen, and buried with a golden amulet placed over his heart. The deaths were not seen as failures. They were seen as mysteries. People used to say that the gods gave and took as they pleased. If a child died, it was because their soul was needed somewhere else. If he survived with deformities, it was because his body had been shaped for a special purpose. The priests never blamed the pairing. They thought that omens, the alignment of stars, or past life mistakes were to blame. In this situation, women had a different kind of problem. If a sister couldn't have a baby, it was thought that she wasn't blessed by God. A sister who gave birth to a stillborn baby was thought to be being tested by the gods. Some were sent away from the palace, while others remained silent and watched, and a younger sibling was given their place. The order of the sisters changed regularly, with new members joining and others leaving. The pharaoh himself was rarely given a choice. His father's advisors organized the wedding. His mother often approved of it. The queen mother had a lot of influence over these decisions. She had been the chosen sister herself, so she knew what was expected. She made sure the pattern continued. If they did that, people would start to doubt, and doubt was dangerous in the palace. There are records of pharaohs who took multiple sisters as wives, not because they loved them, but to increase the chance of having a healthy heir. These marriages were not romantic. They were mathematical. If one sister fails, another might succeed. The women lived in the same building. We track their cycles. We keep track of what they eat. Their dreams are recorded. The first sign of pregnancy was treated like a victory. The children born of these marriages had a strange double status. They were loved, taken care of, and praised, but they were also kept to themselves. He didn't have any playmates from outside the royal family. They didn't have any contact with the city outside the palace. Their world was built of marble, linen, and silence. Every movement they made was explained by what they were feeling. They were recorded saying everything they said. They belonged to the gods, not their parents. What worries me the most is that the desire to protect one's family was ignored because of the loyalty to the bloodline. The system continued to fail even as it became more and more obvious that it was breaking down. The system of power was so rigid that it couldn't bend, only break. And when it did break, you often couldn't see the damage. A king might become king with a hidden illness. A queen might lose her baby in secret. A child might be buried without a name. But people carried on doing it, not because it worked, but because they thought it was important. People believed in ancient Egypt more than they believed the evidence. Sometimes, a pharaoh tried to marry someone who was not from their family. But people did not like these attempts. The priesthood warned of divine anger. The advisors spoke quietly about how the government might change. The marriage might go ahead, but the child born of it would never be seen as equal. The blood was too thin. The gods are too far away. And so the circle closed again. Brothers and sisters, uncles and nieces, cousins whose names were the same. They met in dark halls, reciting prayers from before their birth, touching each other not with passion, but with anticipation. But even in this closed world, there were moments when love appeared where it was not expected. When a prince looked at a servant girl instead of his sister, there were quick, cruel, and secret consequences. The sons born of sacred incest were raised very carefully and watched constantly for signs of divine inheritance. But even being born into the royal family was not enough. Before a pharaoh could take the throne, he had to pass through a series of spiritual tests. Some of these were obvious, like coronation rites and public offerings. Others took place in private rooms, where symbols were more important than words. One of the most mysterious of these was the ritual of gender inversion. Some pharaohs had to transform into the goddess Isis to connect with her. This belief came from the idea that true divine power needed balance. Isis was the perfect example of femininity, magic, and life. Osiris, her brother and husband, was the god of death, order, and renewal. A pharaoh who ruled only as Osiris was considered incomplete. To become the true king, he had to show that he could channel Isis in the same way, not just by praying, but by copying her and changing into her. The ritual was known as the unification of opposites within certain priestly circles. It was more than just a symbolic gesture. The pharaoh was dressed in full female attire, chosen specifically to mirror the depictions of Isis carved into temple walls. He wore a dress made of linen with stars and lotus flowers sewn onto it. His chest was padded to make it look more feminine. He had bracelets on his arms. His feet were painted red, a color often linked to women. His face was painted in soft colors. Kohl made his eyes look red and his lips dark red. He had a wig on that was black and shiny. The change was not meant to be funny or to entertain people. It was meant to get rid of the difference between masculine and feminine, to allow the spirit of Isis to enter and live in the king's body. What makes this ritual so confusing is how quietly and precisely it was done, as if the gods needed costumes and performances instead of just family history. For a short time, the pharaoh was a vessel for the goddess he said he was honoring. His own identity was paused. This is different from how gender is explored today, which is usually personal and not compulsory. This was because they felt it was their religious duty, and the leaders of their religion made sure they did it. If a king refused a ritual, it was seen as a sign that he was unstable, too rigid, and not right for the job. The crown needed to be both soft and strong. Not having both of these qualities was seen as dangerous. When he was ready, the pharaoh was taken into a dark room. He wasn't alone there. A male priest, wearing traditional clothing, was waiting for them. But this priest did not take the lead. He played the role of Osiris. The pharaoh, who was now playing the role of Isis, was told to perform a symbolic union. The act did not always involve contact. Sometimes it was danced. Sometimes it was mimed with a series of choreographed movements. But in a few records, the union is described more directly with physical touch, breath shared, and posture intertwined. The room was silent. One drum beat was used to keep the rhythm. The floor was covered in white cloth. The air smelt of incense. The moment they joined together was marked by the lighting of a lamp, its flame rising quickly, then staying the same. When the ritual finished, the pharaoh was left alone while the attendants took off each part of the costume one by one, as if they were taking off the goddess to reveal the god underneath. He came out of it a different person, not how he looked, but in how things were for him. Now he had experienced both sides of life. He had ruled as Osiris and submitted as Isis. Only then could he sit on the throne and be recognized by the full temple order. This ritual, which was kept secret, was one of the final tests to see if they were ready. If there was no balance, the laws of the universe would be upset. Some pharaohs were happy to take on the role, while others weren't so sure. Records show that one young king cried while everything was being prepared. Another refused to be painted and was forced to kneel before the high priest as a punishment. His coronation was delayed until he agreed. These details were not recorded as a scandal. They were seen as a sign that the gods were still deciding. The clothes used in this ritual were not reused. After the ceremony, they were burned or buried inside the temple. Their purpose had been fulfilled. The pharaoh's body was then washed with a mixture of milk and crushed pomegranate. This was said to make the soul pure and complete the transformation. They didn't eat anything for 12 hours. The king fasted not to show humility, but to prevent his earthly body from overwhelming the divine energy he still possessed. Nobody ever spoke about the ritual in public. Not even the queen was told. The high priest was responsible for protecting the memory. The people who wrote about it used secret codes. A circle resting on a square, a lotus wrapped in a cobra, a man holding two mirrors. These images appear in temple scrolls, but there is no explanation. But the priests understood. What I find so interesting is how a ruler's identity can be changed and rebuilt not through war or politics, but through fabric, color, and silence. The ritual did not make the pharaoh less powerful. It finished it. By playing both roles, he proved that he was not just one person. He was part of a divine pattern. There is nothing like it today. Nowadays, rulers are expected to appear certain, dominant, and in control. But the Egyptian system asked for surrender, for uncertainty, for the ability to change, and reform without opposition. The throne was not a place for clarity. It was a place for balance. As time went on, the memory of the ritual became less clear. Later dynasties made the coronation process easier. The costumes had gone. Symbolic unions were reduced to prayers. But if you look closely at old temples, you can still see evidence of this. There are carvings of men and women's clothes. There are paintings of pharaohs that show both masculine and feminine features. The eyes are outlined in a soft, rather than dominant way. And just beyond the painted walls, another tradition continued, one that cared less about symbolism and more about blood. This was a ritual that took place in underground crypts, not in silk-lined chambers. There, the only light came from oil lamps, and the only sound came from lips pressed shut. After the ritual of gender inversion, which affirmed the pharaoh's balance between strength and submission, there was one final realm to confront before the pharaoh could claim full sacred authority. That world was death. It was not the symbolic death of a transformational ritual fast, but the literal death of ancestors and the certainty that one would also die one day. For the ancient Egyptians, ruling over the living was never complete without first seeking a connection with the dead. To do that, the pharaoh had to come down not in a metaphor, but in reality. There was a rite that only a small group of people in the priesthood knew about. It wasn't written in public scrolls or temple murals. It was held underground in a space that had been dug out of stone and was surrounded by images of jackals, serpents, and winged figures bearing knives. This ritual was called the descent of the breath. And at the center of it was a sexual act that took place not in a palace room, but in a tomb. The pharaoh would be led into a newly consecrated burial chamber late at night with 2 or 3 high priests. They only used small oil lamps, with their flames low and flickering. No torches were used. The tomb was not his own. It belonged to a former ruler, who was sometimes the father and sometimes a symbolic ancestor chosen by the temple. The air inside was full of dust, minerals, and the strong, sharp smell of old incense. A woman was waiting in the chamber near the middle of the stone floor. She was completely naked. Earlier that day, her body had been prepared with oils and herbs to make her breathe more slowly and feel less awake. She had not eaten or drunk anything, and she had not spoken. Her eyes were lined with charcoal. Her lips were a shade of orange. She was wearing a single amulet around her neck. It was shaped like a scarab. She was not a mistress or a priestess in the traditional sense. Her role was specific to this ritual. She had been chosen for her ability to stay still, to control her voice, to cry quietly. She was the human echo in a chamber full of stone. The act itself began with a chant, not loud and not in rhythm. Just say the same phrase 3 times, then stop talking. The pharaoh got down on the ground. His skin had been painted with ash and crushed malachite. He did not wear his crown. He didn't say anything. He gently touched the woman's shoulders, then her chest, and finally her stomach. Each touch was in line with a specific part of the Book of Hidden Breath, a text that only temple archivists know. Then they joined together, not rushed, not over the top. The point of the story wasn't the climax. It was fine. The priest thought that when a body is put in a tomb and moved around, it makes vibrations that can wake up sleeping spirits. The moans, the breathing, the movement of flesh against stone, all of it was thought to be a call across the threshold of death. The ancestors would gather to hear it, listen, and if they liked it, they would speak. This ritual is different to other customs because it insists that the living must physically disturb the silence of death in order to be heard. The pharaoh did not command with incense or offerings. He commanded the space with his body, his breath, and his presence, even though the space was meant to be quiet. Today, people try to connect with the dead by praying or meditating. But in the past, this was a different story. It was urgent, physical, and very real. The tomb was not a place to remember the dead. It was a place to invite them. The ritual continued until the lamps started to flicker. The act was not rushed. If the pharaoh got tired, the priest waited. If the woman cried, the sound was welcomed. After the final movement, the pharaoh put both hands on the stone floor, pressing his palms flat as if to receive something. Then he stood up. The woman stayed. She was not touched again. She was taken to a separate room where she was washed and allowed to sleep. Some women went back to temple services. Others were sent to live in distant estates as a kind of quiet reward. Their names were not recorded. Only a few people who watched the ritual knew about them. There are tombs with inscriptions that hint at this ceremony. One says, "He who called beneath the stone was heard." Another is about breathing in dust. A third was found near the Valley of the Kings. It shows a figure lying with another beneath, a hovering eye surrounded by symbols for silence and eternity. This ritual was not done very often. It was used during important changes, when things were unclear, or when there was a sign that the ancestors were no longer happy. The priests were the ones who started it, not the king. People thought it was arrogant to ask for the right. If someone was chosen, it was seen as both a burden and a privilege. What I find so interesting is how this ceremony sees sexuality not as pleasure or as a way to reproduce, but as something that is like music and is offered into darkness. The act became a form of language, a way of making a statement that would never be forgotten. There were risks. A priest could faint from the heat. The pharaoh might feel dizzy because there is not much air. In one recorded case, a woman collapsed and could not be revived. Her body was buried in the same tomb where the rite had taken place, wrapped in linens marked with the symbol for passage. After the ritual, the pharaoh would not eat for 2 days. He didn't speak to his advisors and slept alone. People thought that in the hours after death, the soul was still open to messages from beyond. During this time, he might dream of people who were kings or queens in the past. He might see visions of the afterlife, or he might see nothing. The silence was also understood. The tomb used for the ritual was then sealed. No one came back. The dust was left undisturbed. The tools were not cleaned. The memory of the rite was kept alive by the breath that lingered in its walls. And the court continued with its daily routine above that sealed chamber. Servants lit lamps, dancers rehearsed, and scribes recorded royal orders. But deep down, a voice had been set free. Nobody knew if it had been heard or not. In another part of the temple grounds, there was another activity waiting to be done. Not underground, but high within the sacred towers. A different kind of union was being organized. One where power was not spoken, but exchanged without words. The offering came from the people who wanted to rule with the king, not from the king himself. In the holy tombs where the pharaoh spoke to his ancestors with his breath and body, the power of the dead was called upon. But above ground, in the living world of temples and courts, another kind of power had to be secured. It didn't come from the spirits of old kings, but from the hands and bodies of the priesthood. There were many secret ways to become king, and one of them was rarely talked about, never written down, and always kept quiet. There was no coronation ceremony, no scroll, and no decree. It involved submission. This was the price some young pharaohs were expected to pay. At the top of the temple hierarchy, priests did more than just interpret omens or manage offerings. They were the ones in charge of the gates. They had to approve the rituals that made a king, blessed a war, or named a child divine. They spoke in riddles, carried staffs carved with forgotten symbols, and lived lives marked by isolation and control. No one could challenge their authority. Their influence was too strong to be ignored. When a pharaoh became king as a grown man, with experience, the temple confirmed that he was the rightful ruler. But when the heir was young, uncertain, or politically weak, the process changed. A private ritual was introduced. This wasn't talked about in public, and it isn't written in the coronation records. Some important religious leaders and the court's advisors were aware of it. It was called the passing of presents. The ceremony, if you could call it that, took place in a special room under the inner temple. A single oil lamp, placed on a high shelf, provided the only light, casting long shadows on the wall. The young pharaoh, who had just been chosen for the role but not yet officially confirmed, was brought in during the night. He had been told to fast, to remain silent, and to prepare himself to receive guidance. A senior priest, who was older and always male, was waiting in the room. The temple considered this priest to be a vessel of accumulated divine energy. His role was not just for show, it was physical. People thought that spiritual authority could be passed on through sex. The king would receive not just teaching, but power, not just agreement, but ownership. What makes this ritual deeply unsettling is the complete reversal of the royal image that is shown to the public. The pharaoh ruled in this room from the moment he stepped into it. He gave in. He didn't say anything. He didn't lead. He lay down and waited. The priest came straight over. The act was slow and not very gentle. It was not meant to be a compliment. It was supposed to be the last part of a set. Compared to modern systems of political succession, which focus on birthright and legality, this ancient belief introduced physical dependence as a condition of authority. The king was not born into a royal family. It had to be activated by touch, and that touch came from someone older, someone with a strong spiritual connection, and someone more important than anyone on earth. There were no other people in the room, just the two people taking part in the lamp. When the act finished, the priest put his hand on the pharaoh's chest and quietly said a line from a temple song. The flame was put out. The king got up, dressed again without saying anything, and was taken to the next part of his public initiation. The ritual wasn't done again. It was a one-time thing, a transfer. After that, the priest went back into hiding. He didn't brag. He didn't go to court, but his name might be said in royal prayers later. His influence could be seen in the quiet decisions made in dreams, which were described to the high council when the young king hesitated before speaking. For the people inside the temple, the ritual was not abuse. It was a function. The human body was like a vessel. The spirit had to be poured like oil. And just as oil needs a container, power needs flesh. The king was set free by the priest. Balance was kept. But outside that room, people started to gossip. Servants overheard bits of conversation. The advisors noticed which priests were made bishops afterwards. Some queens became worried when their sons came back from the temple quieter than usual. But no one said anything. If you questioned the ritual, you were questioning the basis of sacred rule. What worries me most is that now silence is seen as a way of taking part. Everyone knew. No one admitted to having done it. The truth hung around every coronation like the smell of incense that never fully went away. Those who had gone through the rite recognized it in each other. A quick look, a moment of quiet, a shared understanding that something had been given up to get something that could never be taken by force. We don't have any texts that describe this ritual directly, but some temple walls have symbols that, when arranged, suggest the act. A young falcon is resting below a lion. A hand is reaching behind a throne. A reed is bent over a bowl. These symbols were never explained in full. Only people who had experienced the ritual knew what it meant. As time went on, this changed as different rulers took the throne and new religious ideas appeared. The role of the high priest changed. But in the oldest temples, in the scrolls locked away behind false walls, there's still references. They speak of a joining, a touch that opens the path, a moment of quiet binding. For the kings who experienced it, the memory may have been hidden under layers of ritual, war, and public admiration, but it never disappeared in their private moments, in dreams, or in the way their hands lingered over certain temple inscriptions. The ritual continued, a shape in the dark, a cost you never see, only feel. In another part of the palace, there were more visible right-wing groups. In brightly lit halls with polished floors, women waited not to confirm kingship, but to demonstrate fertility. Their bodies were not just a way of spreading the virus, but a way of showing what they could do. And in one structure near the edge of the inner court, a new kind of ritual had started, a place where people could enjoy themselves and hear predictions of the future painted on the ceilings. Not all sacred acts were done in public, but some rituals needed witnesses, declarations, and the presence of the court. Others did well in silence. After priests and pharaohs started to have different rites, another kind of space began to emerge across certain temples. These were not rooms for prayer or sacrifice. They were built for one purpose: to host moments of flesh and spirit, hidden from all eyes except the gods themselves. Some of these buildings were never included in public temple records. Others were described more vaguely as halls of harmony or chambers of divine joy. Only a few people knew how to use them. It all started with architecture. These hidden chambers were smaller and more private than the grand sanctuaries with towering columns and sunlit altars. The entrance was hidden behind a stone wall. Some of them were only accessible through vertical shafts, while others were behind doors that were hidden so well they looked like part of the temple walls. These were not built for parades. They were built to keep them secret. The design inside was completely different. The hard floors and echoing ceilings of the ceremonial halls had gone. Instead, the rooms were warm and had soft light. The floors were made of shiny black stone, smooth enough that if you were naked you could slide across them easily. On one side, there was a shallow pool in the ground that was always filled with warm water mixed with local herbs. The walls were decorated with stars and lotuses, not pictures of gods or wars. Fragrant oil burners were built into the walls, so the room smelt of myrrh and acacia all night. These chambers were not there for people to rest. It was a kind of ritual. Often, the people taking part were chosen a few days before the event. A pharaoh might enter the chamber on his own or with a chosen woman from the temple. She might be a priestess, a servant, or a dancer who has been trained to do a specific type of dance. Before entering, she would be bathed, perfumed, and dressed in thin, see-through linen. She would only speak if someone asked her a question. Her role was not to seduce, but to embody. The act itself was called by many names. The most common one was the divine blending. People believed that in this special place, the pharaoh and his partner's physical union allowed the gods to influence the future. The movements were slow, deliberate, and based on older instructions given by temple elders. Each action was connected to a celestial body. Each touch was like a line from a holy song. The moment of climax was seen as a combination of two bodies and of heaven and earth. The strange part wasn't the act itself, but how the architecture, scent, temperature, and silence were arranged to serve it. The room became like a vessel. The body became a tool. And desire, which is usually thought of as basic or instinctive, was made into something holy. The pharaoh was expected not only to perform, but to be transformed during the act. Today, this was not a bedroom. It was a special place where people went to be close to each other. The difference between comfort and ceremony disappeared. There was no bed. There were no sheets, only the pool, the stone, and the oils. The body had to get used to this. The mind had to be emptied. The ritual had to go smoothly. The temple officials who looked after these rooms were specially trained. They were not guards, but they made sure that people were pure. They cleaned the floors with vinegar and rose water after each use. They refilled the oil lamps. They replaced the herbs in the water bowl. but they never stayed during the act. The chamber was considered sacred because of the people it excluded, not the people it included. Only a few temples were known to have such rooms. Most people were part of big cults like those of Hathor, Isis, or Amun. The rooms were often at the back of the temple, closest to the innermost sanctum. In some cases, they shared a wall with the statue of the god, separated by a thin veil of stone or wood. This was on purpose. People believed that the sounds, the heat, and the energy of the ritual would pass through and awaken the god. Over time, these chambers became well known. Some were said to make any couple who used them able to have children. Others were believed to be able to cure impotence or despair. Some people said that a few of them had secret messages written on them that could only be seen when there was a candle lit. But they all had one rule. Only people with the authority to enter the temple were allowed to go in. If you broke this rule, you would not be punished by a public trial, but by being sent away and cut off from society. The person would be banned from the temple, denied a burial there, and cut off from the gods forever. For pharaohs, these chambers were very special. A place where you can be yourself without worrying about the consequences. A place where you could try out different roles, even the roles of different genders. Some kings chose to lie still and let the priestess do everything. Others preferred to lead, saying sacred lines while touching certain points on the body in a certain order. Whatever the style, the goal was not to make people feel good. It was about getting things in order. The body had to be like the stars. The soul had to open. What I notice is that people were very trusting and didn't like to talk about things. These rooms didn't speak, but they remembered. Each step left a mark of oil. Each time she breathed, the air shifted. Over time, the stones absorbed more memory than the scrolls. But there are no records that describe the rituals in detail. Everything was felt. Nothing was written. Sometimes, parts of this practice can be seen in texts from later periods. A line in a temple hymn speaks of the harmony of two lights touching in darkness. A symbol cut into the edge of a pool looks like the joined hands of a god and a person. These hints are like echoes of the past, suggesting something but not confirming it. In some rare cases, travelers or foreign writers wrote about rumors about the pharaoh's hidden rooms. People thought they were just made up, or even that she was saying something completely wrong. But the fact that these stories have been passed down for centuries suggests something more. These were not just rumors. They were memories kept alive by people who were brave enough to speak them out loud. Eventually, as new religions became more popular and people stopped going to temples, the old ones were left empty. Many of these chambers were sealed. Some were filled with sand to stop people getting in. Others were hidden under renovations. Some may still exist, untouched beneath ruined walls, holding the scent of oil and the echo of breath, waiting for someone to understand what they were meant to hold. While these chambers explored the connection between the human body and the divine in private, a different tradition was developing in the center of the palace. This time, the king or the priestess weren't at the center. It was a queen. She was holding something that was even more dangerous than desire. She held the blood that connected gods to rulers. The hidden chambers may have become quiet, but their spirit is still there. It just moved. When a living body was no longer around to do this, the Egyptians found another vessel, one that could travel into the next world, one that could hold images, memory, and desire all at once. That ship was the coffin. It did much more than just protect the remains of the dead. It became a place where they could express their desires and dreams, and where they believed rituals would bring them eternal life. Many sarcophagi were decorated with traditional symbols of protection, like the winged goddess Nut or rows of prayers written in hieroglyphics. But a smaller number of sarcophagi told a different story. They did not just show gods and offerings. They showed bodies tangled and exposed, merging together. At first, These scenes might not be easy to spot. Some were hidden under the lid, while others were carved into the base of the coffin and could only be seen once it was opened. The details were clear. One example found later on showed a naked woman lying on a bed of lotuses. A man with a beard like the king leaned over her from behind. Their bodies were connected in a way that was very obvious. Above them, there were symbols of new life and stars. At first, some scholars thought this might be a sign of a union between Osiris and Isis, but the woman had no divine markings. Instead, she wore the jewelry of a noble, and her face resembled portraits found on nearby papyrus scrolls. She was not a goddess. She was a person, and this was her coffin. It is one thing to believe in a paradise. It is another thing to plan your entry into it through sex scenes with pictures. For the Egyptians, pleasure was not something to be forgotten when you died. It was something to be kept safe and made stronger. The afterlife was not empty. It was a continuation. They filled their tombs with food, tools, and sometimes sexy stories. If modern people commissioned photo shoots for weddings, these women commissioned erotic murals for their wedding portraits. The purpose was not shameful. It was very important. People used to think that having sex made your soul feel warm and active and helped it to travel between different worlds. In a silent tomb, these images served as both memory and invitation. The artists chosen to create these scenes were not ordinary painters. They were part of a small group of people who were taught about the bodies of both humans and gods. Before they started work, they had to take part in purification rituals. They didn't eat. They bathed in river water before sunrise. Most importantly, they painted nude. This was not about comfort or rebelling. It was a rule. The idea was that the artist had to feel how uncomfortable and exposed the subject was. They could only send the right energy through the bushes at that point. They worked in the dark using oil lamps with blue or red glass covers to set the right color. The outlines were first sketched with charcoal made from Burnham Wire. Then, they added natural pigments like ochre, indigo, and hematite with great care. The focus was always on curves, hands, and the way the hips joined together. Faces were made to look soft, lips were slightly parted, and eyes were half closed. It was not about wanting someone because of their looks. It was a map for the spirit to follow. These paintings were usually found on the inside of the coffin lid or along the side panels near the pelvis. The logic was practical. When the soul leaves the body, it will open its eyes and see the guidance first. The position of the imagery was important, just like the placement of amulets or the wrapping of bandages. Every detail followed a coded instruction. There were other reasons why these scenes were kept inside the coffin. The outer shell had to follow tradition. At funerals, visitors, priests, and family would see the coffin. It had to look right, be respectful, and look like it came from a higher power. But once it was closed, the coffin was no longer part of the living world. It belonged to the dead, and the dead had their own desires. Some families knew about this and agreed with it. Others pretended not to notice. Sometimes female nobles asked for these pictures secretly. They used trusted temple scribes to arrange the work. Payment was often made in secret, for example in the form of oil, linen, or even sexual favors. These commissions were never written into wills. They were secret agreements, shared with bits of papyrus and quick nods while the smoke from the incense hung around. What makes these scenes even more striking is the emotional tone. There is no violence, no shame, and nothing is made to look grotesque or exaggerated. The figures look calm, sensual, and connected. The room is decorated with flowers, fruit, and beautiful fabrics. Sometimes animals like doves or cats are painted nearby. They are symbols of fertility, having children, and warmth. The idea was not to shock, but to calm people down. What I find surprising is the idea that being sexy could be as important as a compass in the underworld. When a spirit moved through the dark corridors looking for its place, it would remember the feeling of warmth, the softness of skin, and how close another body was. The illustration would remind them that pleasure was not a thing of the past. It was a promise that was going to be kept again. Some of the tombs even had smaller stone tablets with similar images placed near the feet or the genitals of the mummy. People sometimes called them heat tokens or passion markers. They were not signed. They didn't have any writing on them, just a picture of two people joining together, usually with one hand resting on the other's chest. It was fine for a while, but then foreign rulers took over Egypt and people's views on religion changed. These sexual images were either erased or buried deeper within the tombs. Later, archaeologists sometimes thought they were just decoration or thought they were made up by later people. But after doing some more research, the pattern became clear. These were intentional, ritualistic, and deeply personal. Today, only a few of these erotic coffins still exist. Some of these are kept in storage at the museum, away from where they are usually on display. Others have been damaged or faded. But in the old archives, sketches and photos show what was there in the past. This helps us to see a world where love and lust are not opposites, but help each other on the journey of the soul. From murals inside a coffin to another ancient practice that was much more visible to the public. The next part of the story about Pharaonic sexuality happened in a different place. This time it involved young men, royal lineage, and a ritual that still confuses historians. When the carvings on coffins were not enough, and the painted scenes began to fade in the dark, some Egyptian women chose a more personal way to prepare for the afterlife. They didn't use images or symbols. They did the ritual themselves, quite literally. One of the most surprising archaeological discoveries recently was a group of female mummies found with small objects hidden inside their bodies. Not in their hands or mouths, as was customary, but placed deep inside the vagina. These were not random pieces of information. They were carefully shaped, deliberately put in, and clearly symbolic. They were, in other words, supposed to bring you luck in the bedroom. These talismans were small, most measuring no more than a few centimeters, just enough to be slipped inside without damaging the tissue. They were made from a range of materials, including limestone, soapstone, hematite, and even glazed ceramic. Each one had a different shape. Some of them looked like penises. They had ridges and flared tips. Others were abstract, shaped like tongues of flame or seeds bursting open. None of them had labels. None of these were recorded in official documents. But where they made it clear what they wanted. It is one thing to wear a necklace for love, but another to die with a phallic charm hidden inside you. For these women, the afterlife was not just about purity, balance, or judgment. It was also about being ready for sex. They believed that when their souls woke up, they needed to be open. Being open to new ideas was not shameful. It was very important. Many Egyptologists were puzzled when the first such amulet was discovered. At first, some people thought it was a mistake. Maybe it was a tool that had been put in the wrong place by the person who was killing the animal. But the object was in the wrong place. It wasn't near the vagina or loose. It was placed with intention near the cervix, facing upwards. Later discoveries confirmed this pattern. This same internal feature was found in multiple female mummies from different dynasties and regions. We didn't find any matching practices in male mummies. No magic amulets were put inside their anuses or urethras. This ritual was specific to female bodies and more specifically to women of elite or priestly status. Some people wore fancy jewelry and had their clothes decorated with elaborate designs. Others had simpler coffins but carefully arranged offerings nearby. but all shared the same hidden charm within. Today, this might be seen as too much, but in ancient Egypt, it was seen as a way to protect and celebrate the feminine spirit. Sex was not just about pleasure. It was a force, a way of connecting to the divine. Some scholars think that these vaginal amulets were connected to the myth of Isis and Osiris. After Osiris was murdered and his body cut up, Isis put his body back together again and put his penis back on. She then had their son Horus through magic. In this myth, it was very important to be able to receive divine seed. It was like being brought back to life. So, when women died, they might have carried a symbol of a penis to show that they were ready to be reborn spiritually. There are clues in old temple writings that support this idea. One text describes the goddess Hathor whispering into the ear of a dead queen, saying her womb must stay warm and open, even when she is not moving. Another speaks of the burning gate, a term believed to refer to the vaginal canal, kept light by magic to lure divine attention. These phrases are vague, but they suggest a belief that the female body was still active even after death. The shape you choose is important too. The phallic charms were not rude. They were smooth, often polished, and sometimes painted with a little red ochre, which symbolized vitality. They might have been shaped like flames or petals to represent the moment of arousal, the point where form and energy meet. They were not meant to represent real actions, but rather to symbolize readiness. The people who put these charms there probably did so in secret. The act was not listed among the standard steps of mummification. It was probably done at night, in the last few hours before the coffin was closed. The charm would be wrapped in a thin layer of linen soaked in resin, then carefully put in place using a tool or by hand. The linen was used for both decoration and to purify the spirit. These amulets weren't mentioned in travel guides or shown on tomb walls. They were personal choices made by the person who had died or their closest family and friends. Sometimes, the charm was accompanied by a piece of papyrus folded and tucked under the pelvis. This piece contained symbols or short magical words, but most were left unmarked and spoke only through form. What I find most haunting is the idea that someone who knew she was going to die asked to be buried with a symbol of desire still glowing inside her. She didn't want people to remember her only for her family or the job she had had. She wanted her final act to be full of anticipation. These charms have caused a debate in modern scholarship. Some museums won't put them on display. Others hide them in storage and label them as ritual items. But the truth is still obvious. These were not random. They were a message, a declaration, a whisper from the dead. They showed that even when a body is rotting, it has more meaning than just how it works. There is no sign that these charms were thought to be wrong or religious. The opposite may be true. They were not keeping it secret because they felt ashamed. They were keeping it secret because they thought it was important and special. Like many of Egypt's most powerful rites, they were hidden not to conceal sin, but to protect mystery. Today, thanks to forensic imaging, researchers can detect such amulets without disturbing the wrappings. In one case, a woman buried near Thebes was found with 3 charms inside her body, arranged in a triangle. Nothing was said about it, but the symbolism is still really interesting. As we carry on with these strange and personal activities, the next one shows how far the obsession with sexual power could go. It was not enough to keep her interested. For some, the body of the pharaoh himself had to be treated as if it were sacred, even after death. There were ceremonies so private that they didn't leave any inscriptions. Others were so shocking that people only whispered about them in the corridors of broken temples. But the ritual of the awakening of the fire god survived in secret and in people's memories. It was one of the rarest events in the religious calendar. This is not a holiday that is celebrated every year or even every generation. It was only performed when the temple's inner sanctum was completely silent, when a statue lost its warmth, when the stone was no longer alive. That was when the priest said that the fire god was asleep and needed to be woken up with ecstasy. The preparations for this ceremony were slow and careful. It started with feeling alone. The chosen participants were kept apart for 3 days. No talking, no touching. They were given honey, dates, and bitter herbs to cleanse the body. In the morning, they had water with blue lotus in it poured over their heads. No one had told them what would happen. Only the high priest and a few other temple scribes knew the full order. Most people's bodies would react before their minds understood what was happening. On the 4th day, at sunset, the initiates were taken to the most holy place. They went in single file, eyes down, feet bare. They took off their clothes one by one. Each layer was a part of the self, a surrender. When it got to the inner chamber, there was no cloth left. The floor was covered in smooth black stone, warmed from below by hidden fire. In the middle of the room, there was a huge statue made of iron that had been brought down by a meteor. It was said to contain the essence of a fallen star, cold to the touch, always asleep. The point of the ceremony was simple. The idea was that pleasure would make people think about the divine. But the execution was not simple. The people taking part were told to lie down on the warm stone floor and start touching each other. Not with violence, not with haste, but with a rhythm that matched the breath of creation. The air would be filled with moans, the sounds of sighs, and the scent of sweat. They were told not to look at the statue. It would only see them through feelings. As they got more excited, the priests went around the room, quietly saying chants and putting crushed cinnamon and resin onto the fire ducts. Imagine being asked to lie naked in a temple, surrounded by strangers, and being expected to climax as an offering to a god made of rock. That was the job of the chosen, but was also their honor. The orgy was not chaotic. It had rules. Participants had to swap partners every time the flame under the statue changed color. The goal was not individual freedom, but collective spiritual growth. People say that when enough people are enjoying themselves at the same time, the god will get involved. You could feel a sort of tingling or buzzing sensation through the floor and in the air. If it happened, the statue's eyes would glow a little red. That was the sign of success. There were riders in the upper room, out of sight but always watching. They did not take part. Their job was to watch and note the number of rotations, the pace of moaning, and the order in which bodies collapsed from exhaustion. Every detail was important. This was not a moment of weakness. It was sacred calculus. If modern psychologists could look closely at this ritual, they would need years of therapy afterwards to explain what they saw. But in ancient Egypt, this was just another way to balance the hidden forces of the world. Some of the people taking part were too tired to finish the ceremony. When that happened, they were gently pulled to one side and allowed to lie near the holy tombs at the back of the room. These were not punishment zones. They were places where people could rest. People thought that those who fainted from being so overwhelmed with religious joy were closer to their ancestors in spirit. They were rewarded with a place to sleep next to the dead. This would allow their dreams to take them directly to the realm of the fire god. There are no records of children being conceived from this ritual. That was not the point. Becoming a parent was just a side effect. The real aim was to make enough heat, tremors, and noise to wake the stone god from his sleep. We don't know if this actually worked, but the ritual survived for many generations of rulers, even as other ceremonies were forgotten. The number of people taking part changed. Some ceremonies included only a dozen, others at close to 100. They were chosen based on astrological signs, bloodline, and sensitivity to perfumes. People thought that those who responded quickly to scent were more in tune with spiritual vibrations. There were risks. Fainting was common, so people were burned by the hot floor. Some people hurt their joints or ligaments in the chaos. But no one was allowed to stop until the priest said the ritual was finished. When they were done, they washed the floor with rose water and salt. People taking part were wrapped in white linen, given lotus wine, and taken outside before sunrise. They were told not to talk about what they had seen or felt for 3 months. Some historians think that the whole ritual was actually about making people loyal to each other, not waking up a statue. Others say it was a way to get rid of bad energy in the community and that they put it into the statue to hold it. But for those who experienced it, there was no doubt. Something changed, maybe God or the stone. Something stirred in the fire and stone. The idea that human intimacy could be used as a weapon to gain divine attention is worrying. It makes you think about how far people will go when they feel like they're being left alone by God. Although the ceremony was less popular after the late period, parts of its ritual were later used in Coptic mysticism and even in erotic spells in Greco-Roman Egypt. Its legacy is a myth and a memory. The next ritual takes that relationship between body and symbolism even further, not with group ecstasy, but with silent art. Because sometimes what you don't say can be written on wood and buried with you forever. In ancient Egypt, rituals were a mix of ceremony and cruelty. One of the most disturbing things was the sexual sacrifice of male slaves to the royal women of the palace. This was not just a personal pleasure or a way of showing who was boss. It was a ritual with a declared divine purpose, organized to help the queen conceive a royal heir when the pharaoh had failed. The method was extreme, the logic was confused, and the aftermath was always cruel. The process began long before the ritual itself. Sometimes, young men working as slaves in the palace were picked out and checked over. They were measured, their bodies checked to see if they were the same shape, and their private parts checked to see if they were healthy and able to have children. They were not told why. They were just moved to a quieter area, given slightly better food, and were washed more often than the other prisoners. This attention felt like good luck. For many, it was the last comfort they would ever know. The priest thought that if the pharaoh's seed was weak, a foreign body could help with fertility while keeping the queen's status. As long as the gods approved of the ritual, the child was considered royal. But the slave involved was never meant to live long enough to see it. On the day of the ritual, the chosen slave was awakened before sunrise. His body was washed with special oils and covered with powdered amber. He was given a small amount of date wine, enough to make him feel less aware, but not drunk. Then, without any formal procession or celebration, he was taken into a room under the main temple. There, the queen would wait alone or sometimes with a priestess or an elder advisor. The slave was expected to do whatever was asked of them without complaining. He had no choice. His hands were often tied up with silk cords, not to restrain him, but to symbolize surrender. In ancient Egypt, sexual exploitation was seen as a sacred role. The queen was said to take on the energy of the offering through the act. People thought that the breath, sweat, and soul of a man sentenced to death had strong energy. After the act, there was no pause for gratitude. The priest came back in, and the ritual moved on to the next part. Most of the time, the slave was taken to another room and killed right away. Sometimes it was by strangulation with a ceremonial cloth. There are other ways it can happen, like through bleeding. It can also happen in rare cases, like when someone is buried alive under the queen's chamber as a living sacrifice. The chosen method was based on the priesthood's understanding of the signs that day. What happened next was even more disturbing. In some cases, the genitalia of the slaves were kept in small shrines and painted with gold to show that they were powerful and divine. These objects were not hidden. They were shown to guests as proof of the queen's connection to fertility magic. The slave's death was not a secret. It was obvious. The women in the court were told to look away if they did not want to see. But many people watched. Some people thought that the act gave spiritual power to the queen. Others just watched in silence, trained to hide their feelings. Modern ethics would be completely undermined by this kind of ceremony. Try to picture a sacrifice that is allowed by the state and involves sexual contact, death, and religious reasons. It is written down in public records. This was not a common event. It was only used during crises, such as when a pharaoh was getting old and could not have children, when a queen had lost a baby more than once, or when political enemies questioned the legitimacy of a royal child. In these cases, the priesthood stepped in to oversee things, not to judge or change behavior, but to keep an eye on things. They did not think it was wrong to do it. They only made sure it was effective. Some of the queens involved became infamous in temple records. One of them was said to have performed this rite more than 3 times during her reign. People whispered that her son, a powerful ruler in his own time, was born of such a union. The name of the slave was never recorded. The effects on the royal women were not talked about in official documents. There was no room for sadness, guilt, or doubt. The queen was the symbol of the nation's future. Her body belonged to Egypt, not to her, and the lives lost because of her fertility were also Egypt's. Reading these records, I feel a strange mixture of awe and revulsion. The way they use symbolism is amazing, but it's hard to ignore the human cost. The room where the rituals happened has never been found in one piece, but bits of carved ivory and hieroglyphs, old writing, show that it was decorated with stars, serpents, a type of snake, and pictures of Hathor, the goddess of love and motherhood. It's a sad twist, especially given what happened there. There were times when the ritual was stopped. On one occasion, a slave was able to scream during the process. The priesthood thought this was a bad sign. The queen was kept alone for 7 days. The room was cleaned with vinegar and myrrh, and the body of the slave was burned instead of buried. No more rituals were allowed that year. By the late New Kingdom, fewer people did this. It wasn't because of compassion, but because more queens started using sacred objects, incense rituals, and fertility amulets instead. The priesthood started to focus more on spiritual energy than on physical actions. However, there are still mentions of the offering of flesh in temple margins, and these are always done with reverence and never with shame. The fact that such a practice could exist within one of the world's most advanced civilizations shows just how complicated power, gender, and belief can be. It reminds us that cruelty and sanctity, being holy, often look the same. People still don't know what happened to the bodies of those sacrificed. Some people say they were burned and scattered. Others think they were buried under temple floors and hidden from history, but they were never completely forgotten. The next ritual takes us into even more forbidden territory. It was not about the queen or the pharaoh, but about the royal daughters and what was expected of them before their first moon blood could change everything. In the old and private rooms of ancient Egyptian temples, where few outsiders were ever allowed, there were strange rituals involving objects that most people can't imagine. Among them were small jars made of alabaster, lapis lazuli, or dark green serpentine. These were not perfumes or oils, as one might expect in the world of ancient royalty. These were vessels designed to hold the pharaoh's semen, which was very important to them. The idea of storing a pharaoh's semen in a gemstone jar might sound like something from a story or like a symbol, but to the priests who were in charge of fertility and continuity, it was a holy material that connected the gods and the people. The pharaoh was seen as the living embodiment of Horus. He was more than just a king. He was a god whose essence had to be kept alive. His sperm was collected carefully, made pure by priestesses, and sealed into jars. Each jar had special markings, words said over it, and each jar had a role in fertility rites. The collection process was very organized. It didn't just happen randomly or during illness or stress. This only happened at certain times that were important in astrology, like eclipses, the start of the year, or when getting ready for temple fertility festivals. The pharaoh would be taken to a chamber that had been prepared in advance. Its walls were painted with pictures of sacred union, and the air was filled with incense smoke. After the ritual collection, the semen would be mixed with a tiny amount of gold dust or frankincense ash before being sealed. These jars were kept in the House of Life, a holy part of the temple where only important religious leaders were allowed to go. Some are placed next to statues of Isis or Osiris, gods associated with rebirth, farming, and the afterlife. Others were stored in underground spaces where the temperature and moisture were controlled by the natural shape of the building. It's a basic way of preserving things, but it works really well. In ancient Egypt, something as personal as a semen's staff was treated with the same respect as a royal scepter, a symbol of power and status. The jars weren't left to gather dust. They were often used in cases where the pharaoh was getting old or had no son to take over his throne. In these cases, it was thought that the preserved semen kept its special power and could be used in ceremonies where a surrogate or even the queen herself would symbolically receive the seed through special actions. There is some evidence that it was mixed with spring water and given to virgin priestesses to drink. People believed that it would bless their wombs and keep the divine bloodline alive. To people used to modern ideas, the whole idea might seem more like something from a strange book than something that really happens in real life. But we have found bits of temple logs and pictures on ceremonial papyrus that show these things happened. There are pictures of jars being placed at the feet of statues of priestesses. The priestesses are chanting over vessels wrapped in linen threaded with gold. There are also pictures of women bowing before altars where these jars sat. You can see these pictures at several temple sites. In some tombs, these jars were even buried with a pharaoh, placed near his chest or between his feet. People thought they would make him powerful in the afterlife. People thought that when you died, you would keep on living as if you were still alive. They thought that a pharaoh without children would be seen as incomplete in the next world. So his own special power became part of the tools he used. It's not unlike modern sperm banks, except ours are kept in sterile labs, while theirs were surrounded by chants, oil lamps, and statues of gods with jackal heads. There were rules, of course. You couldn't be taken out at any moment or mood. Priests often looked to the stars and planets to decide on a date for the ritual. The jars had to be shaped in a certain way. Sometimes they have pointed bottoms that are meant to be put into the floor of a temple to make the temple feel more sacred. Others were hourglass-shaped, representing the cycle of fertility and time. Sometimes, jars would be broken on purpose. This was done during offerings meant to awaken or energize the fertility of a land. The idea was that by releasing the pharaoh's special seeds into the earth, the soil would become more fertile. Sometimes, when the Nile was flooding, people would pour the contents of the jars into the riverbanks to bless the waters. These jars could contain real or symbolic items. Some priests did not agree with the exact meaning. Some people thought the semen in the jar was a symbol. They thought it was a special liquid that was made using magic to look like royal seed. But written records rarely make such distinctions. The way the jars were handled shows that this was more than just a symbol. As time went on, the practice changed. In later dynasties, some jars also included hair clippings, nail fragments, and blood from the pharaoh. People thought that these additions would make him more powerful. For a short time, some jars were blessed and given to dancers or priestesses at the temple. This was a mix of ritual and daily life, which was eventually banned. Reading about these rituals, I find myself equally fascinated and disturbed. The way they treated bodily fluids in a ritual way says a lot about their beliefs about God and also about their ideas about power. Even today, museum curators sometimes find small jars with writing on them in their archives in Europe and Egypt. This writing tells us that these jars were used for religious purposes. Their contents have long since dried out or been lost, but their purpose is still clear in the markings. Some are kept in special rooms and not often shown to the public. This is not because they are ashamed of them, but because most people would not understand what they are seeing. The Pharaoh was more than just a ruler of men. He was also a ruler of meaning. The state used his body, his desires, and who he really was to further its aims. It did not let him decide for himself, but instead acted in accordance with religious beliefs that had developed over many centuries. Even after he died, his body was treated as if it belonged to the state. What's more surprising is that these ideas spread beyond the pharaoh. In the next part, we'll look at how some royal daughters were taught from a young age to take part in similar rituals. They were not just passive, but actively kept the divine cycle going. Hidden away in the sealed temple chambers and private archives was a type of papyrus that no one was ever meant to see. These were not royal orders or lists of grain offerings. These were instructional scrolls that were hand-drawn in ink made from soot and wine. They showed human bodies in very specific positions having sex. These illustrations were very realistic, which was unusual for the time. They were not like the stylized pictures found in temple murals. The branches are bent. The photos were taken to show how happy they were. The positions were different, and many of the scenes had notes that described the movement, the rhythm, and the purpose. These scrolls were part of a set of knowledge known as ritual erotica. In ancient Egyptian beliefs, sex was not just for making babies or being happy. It was a tool for divine alignment, a way to restore cosmic balance, and sometimes a medical solution for couples who could not get pregnant, especially those from noble or priestly families. These scrolls were brought out to teach people, not to entertain them. The acts shown were believed to copy the first unions between gods and goddesses. By copying them exactly, couples could supposedly unlock blocked fertility channels or realign their energies with sacred rhythms. Only high priests and priestesses were allowed to handle these scrolls. They were kept in locked wooden cabinets. These were usually painted black and marked with hieroglyphs that warned people not to desecrate, damage them. If a commoner saw one of these drawings, they would be punished severely. Even the palace guards who carried the scrolls had to keep their eyes down and their hands covered. This was not because the scrolls were seen as shameful, but because they were considered powerful. The idea was that only those who were spiritually prepared could withstand their energy without being harmed. Ancient Egypt was the first to make pornography into a kind of religious education. Most scrolls were brought out during a ritual called the alignment of the flame, which was performed on certain moonless nights. During the ceremony, the barren couples were taken into a special room. The room was filled with smoke, lit with flickering oil lamps, and decorated with painted images of lotus, ankhs, and scarabs. The scrolls were then unrolled by a temple attendant and placed on a stone table. The couple would watch while a priestess, who had been trained in both healing and erotic techniques, gave them instructions quietly. In some versions of the ritual, couples were expected to perform one or more of the acts shown in the picture in front of the priestess. This was not the same as being a voyeur. It was a correction. Just as a healer would guide a patient through physical therapy, the priestess would observe and make small, gentle adjustments. A shift of the hip, a slowing of the breath, a touch relocated by inches. People thought that if you did it wrong, it could block the flow of life energy. If bodies were properly aligned, It would be easy to get pregnant, but these teachings were about more than just infertile couples. In temples dedicated to Hathor or Isis, selected temple dancers were also taught using these scrolls. The goal was not to seduce, but to find someone who was already open to the idea. Their movements were like a kind of dance, and they were done in a way that reminded people of the sacred unions. It was like they were all part of a living sculpture that represented fertility. During certain public festivals, these dancers would perform symbolic movements drawn from the scrolls, though no one in the crowd knew the full meaning behind the gestures. What surprises modern readers is not just the presence of erotic material, but the clinical detail. The positions were drawn from different angles. The notes included recommended times, breathing patterns, and even dietary advice for the days leading up to the ritual. Some scrolls suggested specific times of day and moon phases for each act. Others warned against being too passionate, saying it could reduce the man's spiritual energy or cause problems in the womb. It is similar to the fertility clinics of today, except that there's involved oil lamps, guarded doors, and priests holding chalk. Some scrolls were lost or damaged over the years, either by fire or theft. Others were deliberately destroyed during times when rulers wanted to get rid of anything they thought was too extreme or old-fashioned. But a few survived. In recent decades, bits of it have been found in digs, mostly near Thebes and Saqqara. Museums often put them into groups like domestic life or medicinal illustration. But once you understand the context, it's clear what they're trying to do. These scrolls are difficult for modern Egyptologists to understand. It's not that they're vague, but because the modern lens sees eroticism as something personal. The ancient ones saw it as a divine performance, but we might feel embarrassed by it. They might have knelt before it, and they were afraid of things like the wrong technique, bodies that were not in the right position, and the wrong combinations. We often dismiss this as superstition, but for them, sex was more than just a physical act. It was a prayer made with the body. Every movement was like a part of that prayer. I find it strangely comforting that such rituals existed. It reminds me that people have always tried to make sense of life's mysteries in ways that reflect their time, their fears, and their hopes. The guards who once stood outside those ritual chambers are long gone. The couples who looked at those scrolls by the light of a lamp never knew that one day their most private moments will be talked about in university classrooms. The artists who created these sculptures could not have imagined that tourists would be looking at their work through the glass in museums. And yet here we are, still wondering what it all meant. I was shocked by how far belief could take the body. The story of ancient Egyptian sexuality is not just about strange practices. It is about how every part of human life, even the most private, was used as a tool for power, worship, and healing. Pharaohs offered their bodies to the gods. Priestesses directed pleasure with the precision of a mathematician, and couples desperate for a child were told to mimic drawings that no one else was allowed to see. This is where ink meets skin, where ritual meets desire, and where temples guard not just treasure, but knowledge is so strange that the public could not understand it. It shows that in the ancient world, the line between what was considered holy and what was not always clear. Everything touched everything else. Tonight, imagine not just a strange history, but also the quiet truth behind it. Even in a world ruled by gods and gold, it was human desire that shaped the rituals we now find so strange. Good night, and I hope you have some strange dreams tonight.